school in small-town Alabama. He was speaking about why he'd entered the race in the first place, and he said it was because he wanted a platform to discuss a very important issue. And that issue was the unsolved murder of a local school district employee. And then, right there, in front of all the news cameras and microphones, this candidate said he knew who committed that crime, because it had been revealed to him in a dream. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to your next big house party. But be sure to give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 4th, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits rushed around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband Barry, who was washing the dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and they were both getting ready for busy days at work. Charlotte was a school administrator, and Barry was the acting mayor of the small town of Lynette, a very tight-knit community of about 9,000 residents. And as Barry left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room, Charlotte, who was pouring herself some coffee, reminded him that she had a hair appointment later that morning, and also that she'd be home later than usual because she had a meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. So Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a legal battle with her cousin Wayne over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had left a lot of valuable land to Charlotte, but Wayne thought that he deserved some of that land too. So basically, he was contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their attorneys were going to meet and attempt to hash it out. Barry asked Charlotte if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. And Charlotte shook her head and said no, and said she was still kind of thinking it over. Now, she knew she didn't want to just give up the land, but she also knew that she didn't necessarily want to risk tearing her whole family apart over money. Barry walked over to her and put a hand on her shoulder and reassured her that whatever happened, the family would get through it. Then he gave her a kiss on the cheek, and he left for work. Once he was out the door, Charlotte left the kitchen and went upstairs and knocked on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. And as soon as she did this, Charlotte heard a groan from inside the room. So Charlotte opened the door up, and she found Kara curled up in bed. And Kara was looking very tired and very pale. But, Charlotte knew this was not just a teenager who didn't want to, go to school or something. The reason that Kara looked the way she did and was sounding the way she did is because Kara was pregnant, and she was dealing with pretty obvious morning sickness. Now, Charlotte was not thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But more than that, she was especially not thrilled because she absolutely hated Kara's boyfriend, Dave Reed. Dave drank and got into trouble with the law, and he just was not the kind of guy Charlotte wanted her daughter around. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had forbid her from seeing Dave. They said, "You cannot date him." But in secret, the two had continued to see each other, and now Kara was pregnant. And so Charlotte really couldn't help but feel deeply disappointed in her daughter. But she also knew her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to be a teen mom. And so for right now, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. So with that in mind, Charlotte stepped into the bedroom and asked Kara how she was feeling. And Kara just kind of shrugged and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded along and kind of helped straighten up her room for a second. And then she reminded Kara that her older sister Heather was coming home from college that night, and so it would be nice if they all had dinner together as a family. And Kara said, she did have a babysitting gig for basically the whole day, but she promised she would make it home for dinner. Charlotte was pleased and told Kara she would see her later that night, and then she said she had to get to work. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went downstairs, grabbed her purse, and then out the door she headed to the garage to go to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30 a.m., Charlotte drove back down her quiet residential street toward her house. She lived in a respectable upper-middle-class neighborhood where basically all the neighbors seemed to know each other, and historically crime had been very low, Although recently there had been a string of robberies in the area, which had some people on edge, but for the most part, Charlotte and her family felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, and then she'd gone to the salon for a haircut, and pretty soon she had to get back to the office for a few more hours before her afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. However, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked right after leaving the salon. So first, she wanted to stop by her house and restyle it herself before heading back to work and finishing up her day. So she pulled into her garage and ran inside the house and went straight upstairs right to the bathroom. And as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. And the sound surprised her because she thought that Kara was off at her babysitting gig, and Barry, her husband, usually didn't come home during his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 p.m., Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, Heather, pulled up to the house. She'd just arrived from college, which was located a few towns away, and she was excited to see her parents and sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something odd. She saw the garage door was open and her mom's car was parked there. And this surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6. But Heather didn't think much of it, so she just grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of grocery bags filled with her stuff out of the back seat of the car. And then as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw the door that led into the house was actually already open, but just a crack, which was kind of odd. Like, there's no reason that door would be left open. And so now, sensing that maybe something was off here, Heather walked up and slowly pushed that door open, and she just called out for her mother to see what she was doing, but there was no answer. And so Heather stepped into the house, into the kitchen, and set down her hamper and the bags. And then she began walking around the first floor of the house to just see where her mom was. She didn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She's just walking around, and as she rounded the corner into the foyer, she saw her mom. But her mom was laying at the foot of the stairs, totally motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom and just grabbed her to see if she was okay, but when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold. And so she ran into the other room, picked up the phone, and called 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive, and he'd been very surprised when the dispatcher told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's mayor, Barry Waits. Now, as he pulled up in front of the home, he saw this young woman come running out the front door, crying hysterically. And so Lieutenant Carter, he stopped his car, he got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who begged him to come in and help her mom. And so Carter and this young woman rushed over to the house, and then he told her to stay outside while he went in and investigated. And so she did. She stayed out front and just quietly wept to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door, and right away, right inside, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase, and she was totally motionless. Nearby, the contents of a purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down and felt for a pulse on this woman, but there was nothing. And so Carter, he stood back up and just kind of assessed the scene, and what he noticed was there was foam at the corner of this woman's mouth. So he wondered if maybe she had had a seizure or some sort of allergic reaction at the top of the stairs and sort of had lost her balance and maybe fell down the stairs and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed there were definitely a few drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he noticed there were pretty obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a red mark around her neck. And he realized this woman likely had not just fallen down the stairs. She'd been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled. If you're hiring, you want a candidate who is passionate about your role, but you can't get that insight from a resume unless you post your job on ZipRecruiter. And now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballen. I remember hiring someone who checked all the boxes, but what really sold it was just how interested they were. You could tell they had already bought into the role and wanted to grow with it, and that really made a huge difference. And that was thanks to ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology that finds qualified candidates quickly. And ZipRecruiter has a new feature that shows you the most interested qualified candidates first, so you meet the right people faster. Candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. Find candidates who really want your job on ZipRecruiter. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter. Later that day, around 5 p.m., Lieutenant Richard Carter sorted through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half hour, he'd been scouring the crime scene for clues, and now he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots that looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to take the towels into evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood was even Charlotte's, but if it was, it could be a potential clue. After searching the whole house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry, and the TV and other valuables were still in the home. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but her cash and her credit cards were still in her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He thought maybe the killer just kind of dumped out the purse at the end to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a weak attempt. This did not seem like a robbery. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard commotion by the front door, and so he went to go see what was going on, and he saw there was a man out on the doorstep literally being physically held back by 2 forensics officers. And then after a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside, but Barry pushed past them, and right away, he saw what they were kind of keeping him from, which was his wife's body laying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room and sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't. Barry was gasping and really was struggling to breathe. And then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. And Carter thought maybe he's having a heart attack. And so instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 p.m., Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked to see Barry Waits. But the nurse said he would have to wait because they were still running tests on Barry and he couldn't have any visitors until they were sure he was stable. And Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this. Not because he was, desperate to get in there and console the mayor. It was actually because he needed to talk to the mayor. This is the spouse of a potential murder victim. He needed to know what Barry knew. And so he turned to leave, but before he did, he noticed sitting in the waiting room was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather, who, Carter and Heather, they had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day when, Heather was the one who came running out and directed him into the house. They had spoken a little bit, but Carter thought, what, if I can't talk to Barry, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation right now. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up and definitely recognized who he was and sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter, he walked over, he sat down next to her, and he saw there was actually another girl, a teenager, who was sitting next to Heather, and Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara, and then he asked both women, how was their dad doing? And Heather said that the doctors so far believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was likely a panic attack, but they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed very upset. They had tears in their eyes. They both appeared to be in shock. They hadn't done anything suspicious, really. But Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to really ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them some questions. So by this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 a.m. that morning. And it was not until about 1 p.m. that her coworkers called her house because she had not come back to work, and they said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So with that in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they'd been that morning and afternoon, with a focus on 11 to 1. Kara told him she'd been babysitting all day, and Heather said she'd been at her school, her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 p.m. that afternoon when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother, or who might have wanted to hurt their mom, or who might have, been happy if something happened to her. And the girls immediately shook their head and said, absolutely not. There was no one. I mean, their mom was awesome. Everybody seemed to like her, and they were a happy, normal family. There was no issues they knew of. Carter jotted all this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct debriefing with the other investigators on Charlotte's case. He'd listened to the local news on the radio while driving to work that morning, and since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. So Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. Now, by this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out. Neither of the daughters could have been home between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. And so now the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned Charlotte's neighbors and coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, that had not led to any new suspects. And also, another point of frustration was the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this point in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband. But he was still in the hospital and so was not being allowed to speak to them. But just as Carter and the others were sort of scratching their heads wondering what they were going to do next, the front door of the precinct opened, and who walked in but Barry Waits. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital, and they had determined that his heart was fine, and he really had just had a panic attack. So as soon as he was out of the hospital, he'd come right over here to see what he could do to help with the investigation. And so Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard Armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say he left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop was closed, so he went right back to work, and he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter actually primarily was just looking at Barry's hands and arms to see if there were any scratches or cuts or bruises, because the running theory, based on what they saw at the crime scene, is that Charlotte put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed, and so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, and probably on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, there were no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. And so, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was, telling the truth and that he was not a suspect here. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was telling the truth. At some point, Carter kind of shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea about who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said, yes, he did. There were actually 2 people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He said the first person was this guy named Dave Reed, who was actually their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was kind of a bad guy, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. And so Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things got out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem with Charlotte. He explained that his wife and her cousin were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys the same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up in his chair because he thought to himself that the timing here could not be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from 2 people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a word without his lawyer present. And this made Carter pretty suspicious because during this very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he pretty much leaned right in and grilled Wayne. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family. But he said that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. And in fact, she'd been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. And Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself was just not worth it. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised, because Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he'd literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch, something he typically did, like he was at work truly all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. And Wayne immediately looked at his attorney, and his attorney kind of nodded at him, and so Wayne looked at Carter and said, okay. Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish and just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he'd been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, yeah, I do. He'd heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew, given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was absurd. And so Carter actually just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. And Dave would admit that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte, or Barry for that matter, and he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He'd been at work all day at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi. And he also asked him to provide his fingerprints, to which Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, you're wasting your time. But he said he would do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the strings dangling from her neckline and then used them to strangle her to death. She'd also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. Now, this level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints found at the crime scene, and 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was actually unidentified, and it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. Also, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well, so truly his list of suspects was basically down to 0. So if Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, so a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down because Carter and his team had to take time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They'd also investigated another local man who'd strangled his girlfriend in a similar way to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out this small-time criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Also, in addition to these new suspects having alibis, their prints didn't match the prints found at the crime scene, that third set of prints. But sort of adding more confusion to this was an expert told Carter that actually it seems like those third prints could belong to a child, and so maybe were totally unrelated to the murder. And so now, as Carter looked over at this desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress. And as difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to the pressure he was feeling, that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, that was bad. But Carter also understood their frustration, because he was actually feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends here, he was out of ideas. And he had a feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the case had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather graduated college and was, working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much in politics. And in fact, just the previous year, he'd run for a term on city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife, Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the fact that he had a dream about it, all the attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case, and calls had once again begun flowing to this tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and gossip. But that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office, Carter looked up and saw he was visibly excited, like whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him, what'd you hear? The desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, forensic evidence, and witness testimony, this is what police believe happened to Charlotte Waits on August 4th, 1998. Around 11:30 a.m., the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house and right away recognized Charlotte's car in the garage. And when they saw it, their heart raced with excitement because they hadn't been sure that she'd even be home. But clearly, the killer had gotten here right at the right time. So they parked at the end of the driveway, and they walked up into the garage, and they walked over to the door that led into the house. And they tried the handle and found it was unlocked, so they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away, they heard footsteps on the second floor. And they knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home. So the killer closed the door, they went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them. And Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them standing there. But the killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. And so the killer tried to get her to change her mind, to answer this question differently, but the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument, and then the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte across the face. Blood immediately began pouring out of Charlotte's nose, and kind of stunned, she just kind of stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. Now at this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line, And so persuading Charlotte at this point to do what they wanted was clearly out of the question. Like, this was a no going back moment. So as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with this towel on her face looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind, and they clutched the strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. And so Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer absolutely had her in this chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. And when the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, obviously motionless, very likely dead, the reality of what they had just done, it hit them. And so in a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped. She was using to blot her nose, but she had dropped it on the ground. They grabbed that and they rushed down the stairs and kind of cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face and then dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then they grabbed Charlotte's purse off the table and kind of scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor, and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and basically confronted Charlotte and asked her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped and he killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he needed more money. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to get half of this inheritance because she's given the other half to Wayne, but if I kill her, I'll get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry early on in the investigation was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder, the company would not pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money to their daughters. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Kara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he was. And so it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips to redirect attention away from himself. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. It's probably a nice evening where you are. Maybe you've got the windows open, a breeze coming through, that feeling of safety, of everything being exactly where it should be. Well, back in the spring of 1800, that's exactly how the people of New York felt as they watched their ships come and go from the harbor. The port was the kind of place where merchants made their fortunes, where sailors sang work songs that echoed off the wooden docks, where the smell of fish and possibility hung thick in the salt air. Ships arrived and departed with the tides, as predictable as the sun rising. Nothing strange about it, nothing to worry about. And it was in this harbor that the Eagle sat waiting, her 3 masts pointing toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. She was a beautiful ship, freshly painted, her cargo hold filled with manufactured goods bound for the Caribbean. The morning light caught her brass fittings and made them glow like small suns. The shadows of her rigging created these geometric patterns on the deck that shifted with the gentle rocking of the waves. You could smell the tar mixed with fresh pine from recent repairs, that distinctive scent that told you a ship was ready for the open water. And commanding this vessel was a man who had spent more of his life at sea than on land. Captain James Harding, 42 years old, was the kind of sailor who checked the sky 3 times before believing what he saw. He had this permanent squint from years of staring at horizons, and his face was weathered in that way that made it hard to tell if he was smiling or just bracing against wind that wasn't there. But what really defined Harding was the silver pocket watch he kept in his vest, a gift from his wife Sarah. He would pull it out constantly, checking the time even when time didn't matter, winding it with this almost religious devotion. Every morning at sea, Harding would wake before dawn and walk the entire length of his ship, running his calloused hands along the rigging, checking knots that didn't need checking, inspecting repairs that were already perfect. Then he'd sit in his cabin and write in his log, documenting everything: the weather, the wind direction, the mood of the crew, even on days when absolutely nothing happened. At exactly noon, he would wind that silver watch, the soft clicking sound, almost like a prayer. His first mate, a man named Collins, who'd sailed with him for 10 years, used to joke that you could set your own watch by the captain's routines. To his crew of 18 men, Harding was more than a captain. He was the kind of leader who knew everyone's name, who asked about their families, who made sure the youngest sailors got extra rations when the weather turned cold. And he had every reason to be careful on this particular voyage, because back in New York, his wife Sarah was 7 months pregnant with their 3rd child. This was supposed to be a routine run. Down to the Caribbean, sell the goods, pick up sugar and rum, back home in 6 weeks. He'd done it dozens of times. And on that bright May morning, with not a cloud in sight, the Eagle cast off her lines and began what should have been the most ordinary voyage of Harding's career. The crew worked the lines with practiced efficiency, their calloused hands moving without thought as they untied the Eagle from the dock. You could hear the anchor chain rattling up through the hawse hole, that distinctive metallic grinding that signaled the start of every voyage. The smell of fresh tar mixed with coffee someone was brewing in the galley below. First, Mate Collins stood by the rail, checking off the manifest one last time, his face showing nothing but the calm confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. A small crowd had gathered to wave goodbye, wives and children and merchants who had cargo on board, and I mean, this was just another Tuesday in New York Harbor. Once they cleared the dock, Harding went to his cabin and made his first log entry. He noted the time, 9:15 in the morning, the weather, clear and calm, the wind, a gentle breeze from the northwest, perfect for their southward journey. He described how the Eagle was handling smooth as glass and how the crew was in good spirits. Then he carefully blotted the ink, closed the log, and went back on deck to watch as they passed the location where the Statue of Liberty would one day stand. The water was this deep blue that seemed to go on forever, and you could see all the way to the bottom near the shore, the sun illuminating schools of fish that scattered at the ship's shadow. As they moved into open water, Collins gave the order to set the full sails, and the crew scrambled up the rigging like spiders on a web. Canvas unfurled with these sharp snapping sounds, and when the wind caught them, you could feel the Eagle surge forward, that sudden acceleration that made your stomach drop just a little. Harding stood at the wheel, making tiny corrections, feeling the ship respond to his touch. The wood was warm under his hands from the sun, smooth from years of use, and honestly, this is the part I love about sailing stories, that connection between a captain and his vessel, like they're having a conversation no one else can hear. By midday, they had their course set almost perfectly south, following the coastline at a safe distance. The crew was working the rigging, tightening lines, adjusting the angle of the sails to catch every bit of wind. You could hear them calling to each other, their voices carrying across the deck, mixing with the sound of waves slapping against the hull and the constant creaking of wood and rope that becomes like background music on a ship. One of the younger sailors was singing something, I don't know what, but it had the other men joining in on the chorus, their voices rough but somehow beautiful out there on the open water. That evening, as the sun started to drop toward the horizon, the cook prepared the crew's meal in the galley below deck. The smell of salt, pork, and beans drifted up through the hatches, making everyone's mouth water after a full day of work. The men ate in shifts, some staying on deck to manage the sails, while others went below. Harding ate alone in his cabin, as captains did, but he left his door open so he could hear the crew's laughter and conversation. He made another log entry, noting that they had made excellent time and the weather continued to be, in his words, suspiciously perfect. As darkness fell, Harding organized the watch rotation. 4 men would stay on deck through the night, switching every 4 hours so everyone got some sleep. The ocean at night is a different animal entirely. The water turns black, and the stars come out so bright they almost seem fake, like someone scattered diamonds across velvet. The ship's lanterns created these small pools of warm light on the deck, and beyond them was just this vast darkness broken only by the phosphorescence in the wake. The off-duty crew went below to their hammocks, the gentle rocking of the ship lulling them to sleep with the creaking of timbers as a lullaby. That night, Harding made his final log entry of the day. He wrote about the perfect conditions, the crew's high morale, the steady progress they were making. He estimated they would reach the Caribbean in 12 days at this pace. Then he wound his silver watch one last time, the soft clicking filling his quiet cabin, placed it on the small table beside his bunk, and went to sleep. And as far as anyone knows, that was the last normal night aboard the Eagle. Because after that, well, everything gets strange. It was 3 days after departure when the merchant ship Harmony spotted the Eagle about 200 miles south of New York. The Harmony's captain noted it in his own log, describing how they exchanged signals, the standard greetings between ships at sea. He wrote that the Eagle looked in perfect condition, sails full, moving at good speed. The weather was still clear, the ocean calm. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing seemed off. The 2 ships passed each other, going opposite directions, and that was it. Just another routine encounter on the trade routes. Except that was the last time anyone ever saw the Eagle or her crew of 19 men. Weeks passed. And back then, it wasn't unusual for ships to be delayed. Bad winds could slow you down, or you might make an unscheduled stop for repairs or trade opportunities. So when the Eagle didn't arrive in the Caribbean on schedule, there was concern but not panic. Merchants in New York started asking questions, checking with other ships that had made the journey, trying to piece together where she might be. And that's when Sarah Harding started her daily walks to the harbor. Actually, let me back up here. You need to understand what this was like for the families. Sarah Harding was 7 months pregnant, and every morning she would walk down to the docks, her hand resting on her belly, and she would watch the ships come in, every single one, hoping each time that this would be the Eagle, that she'd see those familiar sails, that she'd spot her husband at the rail. The other wives of the crew started joining her, this growing group of women who stood together watching the wrong ships arrive, day after day. The harbor master would see them coming and his face would go grim, because what do you say? How do you give hope when you have none to give? The silence felt heavy, wrong somehow. It wasn't just that the Eagle was late. Ships had been late before. It was the complete absence of any information. No other vessel reported seeing wreckage. No debris washed up on any shore. No sailor in any port had heard anything. It was like the Eagle had sailed off the edge of the world, and honestly, this is where it gets me every time I tell this story. The not knowing. The waiting. And that's when the maritime authorities began asking questions that had no good answers. Because here's the thing that made this case so strange. They started interviewing every captain who had sailed those waters in May and June of 1800. They checked weather records. They talked to coastal observers, and what they found was impossible. There had been no storms. None. Not even bad weather. Every single captain reported the same thing. Perfect conditions. Clear skies. Calm seas. The kind of weather that makes sailing so easy it's almost boring. The authorities brought in the Harmony's captain, the last person to see the Eagle, and he testified under oath that the ship had been in excellent condition. No signs of distress, no damage. Crew looked healthy. Everything was normal. So the authorities commissioned search vessels. They sent ships to retrace the Eagle's route, looking for any sign of what happened. And I don't know about you, but I can imagine what that must have been like. Sailors scanning the water for debris that wasn't there. Stopping at every island and port asking if anyone had seen anything. Coming back empty-handed, over and over. The search continued for months. They covered thousands of square miles of ocean. They checked every possible route the Eagle might have taken, every place she might have stopped. They even sailed all the way to the Caribbean and back, interviewing people in every port, and they found exactly nothing. Not a single plank of wood, not a piece of canvas, not one body. The Eagle and her 19 men had simply ceased to exist. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing. Let that sink in. What happened next would haunt the investigators for years, because with no evidence, they had nothing but theories. Pirates? Possible, but pirates typically left some trace, some survivor who could tell the tale, some wreckage from the attack. Mutiny? Why would a happy crew mutiny against a beloved captain, and where would they go? A freak wave? In calm seas with no storms reported by any other ship? Which, when you think about it, is absolutely insane. Every explanation they came up with fell apart under the slightest examination. The maritime authorities eventually had to close the case as unsolved. They declared the Eagle lost at sea with all hands. The families were devastated. Sarah Harding gave birth to a daughter in July, a little girl who would never meet her father. And I mean, imagine that moment. Holding your newborn and knowing your husband vanished into nothing, not even a grave to visit. It would turn out that the mystery of the Eagle would take one more bizarre turn. In 1805, 5 years after the ship disappeared, a sailor walked into a pub in London and started telling anyone who would listen that he had seen the Eagle's crew. He claimed he'd been captured by Barbary pirates off the coast of North Africa, and while imprisoned, he'd met men who matched the descriptions of Harding and several crew members. They were being used as slave labor, he said, forced to work in quarries and mines. He had a list of names he'd memorized, and when investigators checked them against the Eagle's manifest, several matched perfectly. The truth hit the investigators like a truck. If the story was true, if the Eagle had been captured by pirates and the crew enslaved, it would explain everything. The lack of wreckage, the perfect weather, the complete disappearance. But there was a problem. A big one. The sailor couldn't prove any of it. He had no evidence, no way to verify his story. The British government sent inquiries to North Africa, but the Barbary states denied everything. There were no records of the Eagle being captured. No ransom demands had ever been made. And when investigators pressed the sailor for more details, his story started falling apart. The timeline didn't quite work, the descriptions got fuzzy. Eventually, he admitted he might have been confused, might have heard the story from someone else, might not have actually been there at all. So the case remained unsolved. The families were left with nothing but that one unverified story, a tiny thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, their loved ones were still alive somewhere. Sarah Harding held on to that hope for years. She never remarried, raised her 3 children alone, and every time a ship arrived from North Africa or the Mediterranean, she would go to the docks and watch the passengers disembark, looking for a face she would never see again. By 1807, 7 years after the disappearance, maritime law declared the crew legally dead. Sarah could finally settle her husband's estate, could finally try to move on. She died in 1832, an old woman who had spent over 3 decades wondering what happened to her husband on that perfect May morning. And here's what really bothers me about this case. In 2026, we have satellites that can read a license plate from space. We have radar and GPS and transponders. We can track ships in real time from anywhere in the world, and yet ships still vanish. Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, countless fishing vessels. The ocean is still keeping secrets. We like to think we've conquered it, mapped it, understood it. But the truth is, there are parts of that blue expanse that are as mysterious now as they were in 1800. To this day, no one knows what happened to Captain James Harding, First Mate Collins, and the 17 other men aboard the Eagle. No wreckage has ever been found. No bodies have ever washed ashore. The ship exists now only in logbooks and court records, and one pregnant woman's desperate daily walks to a harbor where the wrong ships kept arriving. Some questions have no answers. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying thing of all. Now let's go back on land, to a small farm in Ireland, where a dispute over something incredibly small was about to turn deadly. In the summer of 1801, the Irish countryside was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where everyone left their doors unlocked, and where disputes were settled over a pint at the local pub. The rolling green hills of County Cork stretched out like a rumpled blanket, divided by ancient stone fences that had marked property lines for generations. The air always smelled like rain about to happen, mixed with the earthier scent of peat smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. You could hear sheep bleating in the distance, their bells creating this constant gentle music that told you all was right with the world. And it was along one of these stone fence lines that Peter Hanlow kept his small farm, about 30 acres of decent grazing land where he raised cattle and grew just enough crops to feed his family. The property sat in a little valley where morning mist would collect like a pool of milk before the sun burned it off. His barn was old but sturdy, built from timber his grandfather had cut, with a tin roof that sang when the rain hit it. Inside, it smelled like hay and manure and honest work, and hanging from the rafters were tools that had been used by 3 generations of Hanlows. Peter Hanlow himself, 38 years old, was the kind of man who waved at everyone he passed on the road, who always had time to help a neighbor with a broken fence or a sick animal, who measured his wealth not in money, but in the number of friends he could count on. He had this permanent sunburn on the back of his neck from working outdoors, and his hands were calloused in that way that comes from a lifetime of holding tools and ropes and steering plows. Every morning, he would wake before dawn and walk his property line, checking on his animals, inspecting his fences, taking pride in the land his family had worked for over 100 years. To his wife Mary and their 4 children, Peter was steady as the seasons. He had routines he never varied from. Breakfast at 6, work until noon, a brief rest, then back out until sunset. On Sundays, the whole family would walk 2 miles to the church in the village, and Peter would shake hands with every person there, asking about their families, their crops, their livestock. His eldest son, 12-year-old Thomas, was already learning the farm, following his father around like a shadow, absorbing everything about how to care for the land. What people loved about Peter was his complete lack of pretension. He treated the richest landowner the same as the poorest tenant farmer. When someone needed help, he showed up with his tools and his strong back and refused payment. When someone succeeded, he celebrated with them. When someone struggled, he was the first to offer a kind word or a helping hand. The village priest once said that if every man in Ireland was like Peter Hanlow, there would be no troubles at all. But Peter had a neighbor. And this is where the story takes a turn that still makes me shake my head when I think about it. Living on the adjacent property was a man named Seamus Burke, 41 years old, who had inherited his land from his father just like Peter had. And Seamus Burke had developed an obsession that would consume him completely and end in a way that nobody could have predicted. It started with the stone fence. That ancient wall of rocks that separated the Hanlow and Burke properties had stood for as long as anyone could remember, probably built sometime in the 1700s by ancestors neither family could name. Most of the fence was clear and obvious, following the natural contours of the land. But there was one section, about 20 feet long, where the stones had shifted over the years, where weather and time had caused some settling, where the exact property line had become just slightly ambiguous. Seamus Burke became convinced that this section of fence had been moved. Not recently, but decades ago, maybe even a century ago, and that the Hanlows had been farming on Burke land for generations. He would pace that section of fence every single day, measuring it with his footsteps, staring at the ground like he could see the ghost of where the original fence had stood. And the amount of land he thought had been stolen? 6 inches, maybe 8 at most. A strip of dirt so narrow you could step across it without noticing? His family tried to reason with him. His wife would say, "Seamus, it's nothing, let it go." His children would tell him the fence looked fine to them, that it probably hadn't moved at all. But Seamus would shake his head and mutter about his grandfather, about the family honor, about how the Burkes had always been cheated by their neighbors. He started telling stories about how his grandfather had mentioned the fence being wrong, though no one else remembered these stories. He claimed his father had been too kind to fight about it, but that he, Seamus, would set things right. He approached Peter Hanlow about it one afternoon in the spring of 1801. Peter was in his field when Seamus walked over, and according to witnesses who heard about it later, the conversation went like this. Seamus pointed at the fence and said it needed to be moved. Peter looked at it, genuinely confused, and asked why. Seamus explained his theory about the fence being shifted. Peter, always trying to keep the peace, offered to ask around, to check old land records in the village, to see if they could figure out where the original line had been. But here's the thing, and this is important. Peter wasn't dismissive. He didn't laugh at Seamus or tell him he was being ridiculous. He took the concern seriously, treated his neighbor with respect, and genuinely tried to find a solution. He spent his own time and money traveling to the county seat to look at old property maps. He talked to elderly residents of the village who might remember how the fence had always looked. And every piece of evidence he found suggested the fence was exactly where it had always been. When Peter reported this back to Seamus, offering to show him the maps and the testimony he'd gathered, Seamus refused to look at any of it. He said the records were wrong, the old people were mistaken, everyone was part of a conspiracy to keep the Burkes from their rightful property. And that 6 inches of dirt, that tiny strip of land, became the only thing Seamus could think about. His crops started to fail because he wasn't tending them. His animals wandered because he wasn't watching them. His family ate dinner in silence while he stared out the window at that fence, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. The village priest tried to intervene, suggesting they bring in a neutral surveyor, someone from outside the county who could measure everything properly. Peter agreed immediately. Seamus refused, saying any surveyor would be bribed by the Hanlows. Other neighbors offered to mediate, to help find a compromise. Peter even offered to give Seamus a different strip of land, twice as wide, on the opposite side of his property, just to end the dispute. Seamus called it an admission of guilt and became even more agitated. By July of 1801, Seamus Burke had stopped speaking to anyone except to rant about the fence. His wife was worried enough that she confided in Mary Hanlow, woman to woman, apologizing for her husband's behavior and asking if Peter might just move the fence, even though he was right, just to give Seamus peace. Mary said she'd talk to Peter, and honestly, knowing what I know about Peter Hanlow, he probably would have done it. He probably would have moved that fence and given up his 6 inches of dirt, not because he thought he was wrong, but because he valued peace with his neighbor more than pride. But he never got the chance, because on the night of July 23rd, 1801, Peter Hanlow was working late in his barn. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air feels thick and heavy, where you can smell the grass growing and hear every sound for miles. Peter was repairing a piece of equipment by lamplight, and there's something peaceful about working with your hands when the world has gone quiet. The only sounds would have been his tools against metal, maybe a cow shifting in its stall, the soft whisper of hay under his feet. Seamus Burke walked into that barn carrying an axe. Not a hatchet, but a full-sized felling axe, the kind you use to take down trees, with a blade sharp enough to shave with. Peter looked up from his work, probably smiled, probably said something like, "Evening, Seamus, what can I do for you?" And Seamus Burke, without saying a word, swung that axe at his neighbor's head. The first blow didn't kill Peter, but it dropped him to his knees. The blood drained from his face as he tried to understand what was happening. He raised his hands to protect himself, and the second swing nearly severed his left hand at the wrist. Peter tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood across the barn floor, and Seamus followed him, methodical as a butcher, swinging the axe again and again. The medical examiner would later count 14 separate wounds, most of them to Peter's head and neck, delivered with such force that the barn's wooden floor was gouged in several places where the blade went through flesh and bone and buried itself in the planks beneath. When Seamus finally stopped, when Peter Hanlow lay dead in a spreading pool of blood, Seamus walked out of the barn, still carrying the bloody axe, and sat down on the stone fence. That fence, the one he'd been obsessing over for months. He sat there in the gathering darkness, the axe across his knees, and waited. He didn't run. He didn't hide the body. He didn't try to clean himself up. He just sat on that fence and waited for someone to find him. It was Peter's son Thomas who made the discovery. The boy had come looking for his father when he didn't return for supper. Thomas saw the lamplight still burning in the barn and went inside calling for his da. And what that 12-year-old boy found in that barn is something no child should ever see. Thomas ran screaming to the house, and Mary Hanlow, after making sure the younger children stayed inside, ran to get help from the nearest neighbor. Within an hour, a group of men from the village arrived at the Hanlow farm, some carrying clubs, some carrying farming tools, ready to chase down whoever had done this terrible thing. But they didn't have to chase anyone. Seamus Burke was still sitting on the fence, waiting for them. When they asked him what he'd done, he pointed at the ground beneath the fence and said, "I've taken back what belongs to my ancestors. The dirt belongs to us. It's always belonged to us." The constables arrived and arrested Seamus without resistance. He went with them quietly, still muttering about the fence, about his grandfather, about the 6 inches of dirt that had driven him to murder. During the walk to the village jail, he showed no remorse, no understanding that he'd just destroyed 2 families, ended a good man's life, and orphaned 4 children. He just kept talking about the fence. The trial, if you can call it that, lasted less than a day. Seamus Burke didn't deny killing Peter Hanlow. In fact, he seemed proud of it. When asked to explain his actions, he stood up in court and gave a speech about ancestral land rights, about how the blood of the Burkes had watered that soil for generations, about how Peter Hanlow's death was not murder but a rightful reclamation. He actually used the words sacrifice to the land, like he'd performed some ancient ritual instead of butchering his neighbor with an axe. The judge, a man who had seen plenty of cases in his career, looked stunned. He asked Seamus directly, "You killed a man over 6 inches of dirt?" And Seamus, with complete sincerity, said it wasn't about the dirt itself, it was about principle, about family honor, about setting things right. The courtroom was packed with people from the village, many of them crying, all of them trying to understand how a dispute over a fence line had escalated to this. The jury deliberated for 17 minutes. Guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. Seamus Burke showed no reaction. As they led him from the courtroom, he turned to look at Mary Hanlow, who was sitting in the front row with her children, and he said, "I'm sorry, it had to be this way. But some things are more important than being neighborly," which is absolutely insane when you think about it. Seamus Burke was hanged on September 5th, 1801, in the village square. By all accounts, he remained calm until the end, still insisting he'd been in the right, still claiming he'd only done what his ancestors would have wanted. His last words were about the fence. Even facing death, even knowing he'd orphaned 4 children and widowed a woman who'd tried to help him, Seamus Burke could only think about that 6-inch strip of dirt. After the execution, the Burke property was sold to pay for Seamus's legal fees and to provide some compensation to Mary Hanlow and her children, though no amount of money could replace a husband and father. A surveyor was finally brought in to measure the disputed fence line, and he confirmed what everyone except Seamus had known all along. The fence was exactly where it had always been. The property line hadn't moved. There had never been any stolen land. Seamus Burke had killed his neighbor over an obsession that existed only in his own mind. Mary Hanlow raised her 4 children alone, working the farm with help from neighbors who remembered Peter's kindness. Young Thomas, who'd found his father's body, grew up to be a farmer himself, and he made it a point to maintain good relationships with everyone who lived around him. The barn where Peter died was eventually torn down and rebuilt, but people said you could still see the dark stains in the floorboards where they'd pried up the old wood. In 2026, that farm is still there, still in the Hanlow family, passed down through generations. And the fence, that stone fence that cost Peter Hanlow his life, still marks the property line in exactly the same place it's been for over 200 years. Sometimes the simplest disputes become the deadliest, not because the stakes are high, but because human pride can turn 6 inches of dirt into a battlefield. But not all murders are mysteries waiting to be solved. Sometimes the killer is obvious from the start, and the only question is why. Like in a small village in Bavaria, where 2 brothers would fight over something even more ridiculous, and where an unexpected witness would bring the truth to light. The brutality wasn't done with Europe that year. In the late summer of 1801, in a tiny Bavarian village nestled in a valley so remote that news from the outside world arrived weeks late, Two brothers were about to prove that blood ties mean nothing when greed takes hold. The village of Oberkirchen sat at the base of the Alps, surrounded by forests so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground, and the air always carried the sharp scent of pine mixed with the earthy smell of mushrooms growing in the shade. About 60 families lived there, farming small plots of land, raising goats and chickens, living lives that hadn't changed much in centuries. Running through the center of the village was a creek, narrow enough to jump across in most places, fed by mountain snowmelt that kept the water ice cold even in August. The creek made this constant babbling sound that the villagers had learned to tune out, like it was part of the silence instead of breaking it. Moss covered the rocks at its edges, bright green and slippery, and in the mornings a light mist would rise from the water and drift through the village like ghosts looking for somewhere to haunt. The creek provided drinking water for the animals, irrigation for the crops, and a place where children would catch tiny fish with their bare hands in the summer. In one of the small farmhouses near the creek lived two brothers, Klaus and Johann Hoffmann, who had inherited their father's land 2 years earlier when the old man died of fever. The property wasn't much, maybe 10 acres of rocky soil that grew decent crops if you worked it hard enough, a small house with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained, and a barn that was more gaps than walls. But it also came with something valuable in that community, a milk cow. A healthy, young Holstein that produced enough milk to feed both families, with some left over to sell in the larger town a day's walk away. Klaus Hoffmann, the older brother at 34, had never married, had no children, and had spent his entire life on that farm helping his father. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders from years of hauling rocks out of fields, with hands like slabs of beef and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened because his voice had this low rumble that suggested he was always on the edge of anger. His younger brother, Johann, 29, had married a girl from the next village over and had 3 small children who were always underfoot, always hungry, always needing something. The brothers had agreed to split everything equally. They worked the land together, shared the harvest, and took turns with the cow. One week, Klaus would keep her and get the milk. The next week, Johann would take her. It was a simple arrangement that should have worked fine, except for one problem. Klaus had decided the arrangement was unfair. See, Johann had a family to feed. His 3 kids drank most of the milk he got during his week, leaving him with almost nothing to sell. Klaus, living alone, could sell every drop, and the money from that milk, though not much, was enough to buy tobacco and beer and the occasional new tool. Klaus started complaining that he did more of the work on the farm because Johann was always distracted by his children. He claimed Johann wasn't pulling his weight, wasn't contributing fairly, and therefore didn't deserve half of the cow's production. Johann tried to reason with him. He pointed out that they'd made an agreement that their father had wanted them to share equally, that the cow was as much his as Klaus's. But Klaus wasn't interested in reason. He started talking about buying Johann out, offering a price that was insultingly low. When Johann refused, Klaus suggested they sell the cow and split the money, even though they both knew that would leave neither of them with enough to buy a replacement. The arguments got louder, more frequent, and the other villagers started noticing the tension between the brothers. What the villagers didn't know, what Johann's wife would later testify to, was that Klaus had been making threats. He'd told Johann that if he didn't give up his claim to the cow, there would be consequences. He said accidents happened on farms all the time, that a man could get hurt if he wasn't careful, that it would be a shame if something happened to Johann and left his children fatherless. Johann had laughed it off, thinking his brother was just blowing off steam, never imagining that Klaus actually meant it. On the morning of August 19th, 1801, it was Klaus's week with the cow. The animal was grazing near the barn when Johann came over to talk about the fall planting, trying to maintain some kind of normal relationship with his brother despite the ongoing dispute. The conversation, according to Johann's wife, who watched from a distance, seemed civil at first. The brothers stood by the fence, gesturing at the fields, and she thought maybe they were finally working things out. Then Johann made a joke, something about how the cow seemed to like him better, how she always gave more milk during his weeks. It was the kind of teasing brothers do, meant to lighten the mood, to break the tension. But Klaus didn't laugh. His face went dark, and he turned and walked toward the barn without saying a word. Johann called after him, probably trying to apologize, probably realizing he'd touched a nerve. And that's when Klaus came back out of the barn carrying a rope. He walked up behind Johann, who had his back turned, and looped the rope around his younger brother's neck. Johann tried to fight, tried to pull the rope away, but Klaus was stronger, bigger, and had the advantage of surprise. He dragged Johann toward the creek, and the struggle left these deep gouges in the dirt where Johann's heels scraped, trying to find purchase. By the time they reached the water, Johann had stopped fighting. Klaus had strangled him unconscious. What happened next is where this gets truly cold. Klaus didn't just leave his brother by the creek. He waded into the shallow water, found a spot where there was a natural depression, like a small pool, maybe 3 feet deep, and he held Johann's head under the surface until the bubbles stopped rising. Then, to make sure the body wouldn't float up or be easily found, he piled stones on top of it. Heavy creek stones, the kind worn smooth by centuries of water flow, stacking them carefully until his brother was completely buried under a mound of rocks in the middle of the creek bed. The water was so cold it made his hands ache. The creek only about 2 feet deep in most places, but the current steady enough to flow over and around the stones, and honestly, Klaus must have spent an hour building that underwater cairn, making sure it was stable, making sure no part of Johann showed through. When he was done, breathing hard from the exertion, he climbed out of the creek and went back to the barn to put the rope away. Then he calmly walked to Johann's house. Johann's wife saw Klaus approaching and came out to ask where her husband was. Klaus, his clothes still wet from the creek, told her that Johann had decided to take a trip. He said Johann had been talking about visiting a friend in another village, that he'd left suddenly, that he might be gone for a few days. When she asked why Johann hadn't told her himself, Klaus shrugged and said maybe Johann was upset about their argument and needed time to cool off. She found it strange, but not impossible. Men did disappear sometimes to avoid family troubles, to drink away their problems, to clear their heads. That evening, Klaus went to Johann's house and sat down to dinner with the widow he'd just created and the orphans he'd just made. He ate his sister-in-law's bread, drank her beer, and played with his nephews, all while their father lay dead in the creek less than 100 yards away. When the children asked where their papa was, Klaus told them he'd gone on a long trip and would be back soon, ruffling their hair like a caring uncle, his face showing nothing but calm concern. Days passed. Then, a week. Johann's wife grew more worried. She asked the other villagers if anyone had seen her husband on the road. She sent her oldest son to the neighboring village to check with the friend Klaus had mentioned, but no one there had seen Johann. The village priest got involved, organizing a search party, and Klaus joined them, walking through the fields and forests, calling his brother's name, putting on a performance of concern that almost fooled everyone. But the cow knew. And this is the part that still gives me chills when I think about it. During Klaus's week with the animal, he would lead her to the creek to drink every morning and evening, the same routine he'd followed for years. The cow would walk docilely beside him until they got within 10 feet of the water, and then she would stop. Not just hesitate, but plant her hooves and refuse to move another inch. Klaus would pull on her rope, would try to coax her forward, would even hit her with a stick, but that cow would not approach the creek. He tried different spots along the creek bank, thinking maybe she'd spooked at something in that particular location. But it didn't matter where he tried, the cow refused to drink from the creek at all. She would stand there, thirsty, her sides heaving, making these distressed, lowing sounds, but she would not put her mouth in that water. Klaus had to start hauling buckets from a well on the other side of the village, an extra chore that cut into his day and made him even more irritable than usual. The villagers noticed. Of course they noticed. In a community that small, everyone knows everything, and a cow refusing to drink from the creek she'd been drinking from her whole life was the kind of oddity that got people talking. An old woman suggested the water might be cursed. Another villager wondered if something had died upstream and fouled the taste. The priest, a practical man, suggested they check the creek carefully for anything that might be spooking the animal. A group of men walked the creek from one end of the village to the other, looking for dead animals, for debris, for anything unusual. and in the section that ran behind the Hoffman property, they found the pile of stones. It didn't look natural, the way they were stacked, too deliberate to be random creek bed. One of the men, more curious than the others, started pulling the stones away. The water flowing around his legs was so cold it made his feet go numb, but he kept pulling, and about 10 stones in, his hand touched something that wasn't rock. It was cloth. Waterlogged, covered in algae, but definitely cloth. He called the others over, and together they removed the rest of the stones, and there was Johann Hoffman's body. His face pale and bloated from being submerged for over a week, a rope still tied around his neck, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The men pulled him out of the water and laid him on the creek bank, and someone ran to get the constable, while someone else went to tell Johann's wife, and someone else went to find Klaus. They found Klaus in his barn, and when they told him they'd discovered Johann's body, his reaction gave him away. He didn't ask how Johann died, he didn't ask where they'd found him, he didn't show surprise or grief. He just went very still, his face blank, and after a long moment he said, "That's where he went, then." Like Johann had crawled under those stones himself, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The constable arrested Klaus on the spot. During questioning, Klaus initially tried to maintain that he knew nothing about it, that Johann must have fallen in the creek and drowned, and how tragic, how unexpected. But when confronted with the rope around Johann's neck, with the careful placement of the stones, with his own wet clothes from the day of the murder, his story fell apart. And when they brought up the cow, when they mentioned how she'd refused to drink from the spot where the body lay hidden, Klaus actually smiled. He said, "Animals know. They always know," which is absolutely chilling when you think about it. Under pressure, Klaus confessed. He admitted to strangling Johann, to drowning him, to hiding the body under stones. When asked why, he said it simply. The cow was worth more than a brother. He said Johann didn't deserve half because Johann had children to feed and couldn't contribute equally to the farm. He said he'd done what needed to be done to protect his own interests, and he showed no remorse, no understanding that he'd committed an unspeakable crime over an animal that would be dead in a few years anyway. The trial was held in the regional court in early September. Klaus's defense, such as it was, focused on the cow's value and Johann's supposed failures as a farmer and partner. The prosecutor barely had to make a case. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession clear, and the motive so petty it disgusted everyone who heard it. The jury took less time to convict Klaus than it had taken him to stack the stones over his brother's body. Klaus Hoffman was hanged on September 28, 1801, in the town square. Unlike Seamus Burke in Ireland, Klaus seemed to finally understand what he'd done as the noose was placed around his neck. His last words were an apology to his nephews, though whether he was sorry for killing their father or sorry for getting caught, no one could say. Johann's widow raised her 3 children with help from the village community. The farm was sold, and the money went to support Johann's family. And the cow, the animal that had inadvertently solved the murder through her refusal to drink from the creek, was given to Johann's widow as part of the settlement. She kept that cow for another 7 years, and every time the animal gave milk, she thought about how an animal's instinct had brought her husband's killer to justice when human investigation had failed. In 2026, that creek still runs through Oberkirchen, still cold and clear, still providing water to the village. The locals know the story, passed down through generations, about the brothers who fought over a cow and the animal that refused to drink where murder had been committed. Sometimes the strangest witnesses are the ones who can't speak at all. The cold wasn't done claiming victims that year, because about 1,000 miles east, in the heart of Romania, an entire city was about to learn that sometimes disasters aren't acts of God at all. In the scorching summer of 1800, the city of Bucharest was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The capital of Wallachia sprawled across the Romanian plains like a medieval dream, a maze of narrow cobblestone streets lined with wooden houses that leaned against each other like drunk friends walking home. The Orthodox churches, with their painted walls and golden domes, rose above the chaos, their bells marking the hours while below them. Merchants hawked spices from Constantinople, blacksmiths hammered horseshoes, and children played in streets that hadn't seen rain in over 2 months. The heat that summer was the kind that makes you forget what cool air feels like. By noon, the cobblestones were hot enough to burn through shoe leather, and the air shimmered in waves that made distant buildings look like they were underwater. The smell of the city in August was overwhelming, a mixture of horse manure baking in the sun, open sewers running down the center of streets, rotting vegetables from the markets, and the ever-present wood smoke from cooking fires. People moved slowly, conserving energy, seeking any scrap of shade they could find. But Bucharest in 1800 was also beautiful in its own way. The boyars, the wealthy landowners, had built mansions with intricate wooden balconies and courtyards filled with fountains that provided the only cool spots in the entire city. The markets exploded with color, even in the heat, with bolts of silk and wool, with pyramids of bright peppers and tomatoes, with hanging meats and fresh bread. At night, when the temperature finally dropped a few degrees, you could hear music drifting from taverns, the sound of violins and accordions mixing with laughter and the clink of glasses. Living in one of the poorer districts near the edge of the city was a family whose story represents thousands of others who would be caught in what was coming. Stefan and Elena Popescu, both in their 30s, shared a small wooden house with their 4 children and Stefan's elderly mother. Stefan worked as a carpenter, and his hands were scarred from decades of handling wood and tools. Every morning, before the sun made work impossible, he would be in his small workshop behind the house, the smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with his sweat as he crafted furniture for anyone who could afford it. Elena spent her days managing the household, which in 1800 Bucharest meant hauling water from the communal well 3 streets over, cooking over an open fire in their courtyard, washing clothes in a bucket, and trying to keep her children from getting into trouble. The kids ranged from 3 to 12, and in the heat of that summer, they were restless and irritable, constantly underfoot, constantly begging for water they couldn't spare. Elena's mother-in-law sat in the shade of the courtyard, too old to help, but still sharp enough to offer constant criticism about how things were being done. What Stefan and Elena didn't know, what none of the ordinary people of Bucharest knew, was that their city was about to burn, and the reason why would make the tragedy even more bitter. See, Wallachia at that time was caught between the Ottoman Empire and various European powers, a political situation that meant the local prince needed soldiers, lots of them, to maintain control and defend against whoever might invade next. So they'd hired mercenaries, professional soldiers from across Europe, who fought for whoever paid them. These weren't patriots or believers in any cause. They were men who killed for money, and they were very good at it. The problem was that the treasury was empty. Years of corruption, of boyars skimming funds meant for public works, of officials pocketing taxes instead of sending them where they belonged, had left Wallachia broke. The mercenaries had been promised their pay months ago, but the money never came. At first, they were patient. They'd been unpaid before. It happened. But as weeks turned into months, as their patience wore thin and their pockets stayed empty, their mood turned dark. Their commander, a German named Hans Krebs, made official complaints through proper channels. He wrote letters to the prince's advisors, he submitted formal requests, he did everything by the book, and every time, he was told the same thing. The money is coming. Be patient. You'll be paid soon. But Hans Krebs was a soldier, not a fool, and he could read the situation clearly enough. The boyars were living in luxury while his men went hungry. The officials were building new mansions while his soldiers slept in barracks with leaking roofs. The money wasn't coming because it had already been spent on other things. In July of 1800, Krebs gathered his men and told them the truth. They weren't getting paid, they'd been used and discarded. He gave them a choice. They could leave and find work elsewhere, or they could stay and take what they were owed. Most of them chose to stay, and what they decided to take was revenge. On the afternoon of August 9th, 1800, the Popescu family was going about their normal routine. Stefan was in his workshop, putting finishing touches on a chair he was making for a local merchant. Elena was in the courtyard, stirring a pot of stew over the fire while her youngest daughter clung to her skirts. The older children were supposed to be fetching water, but were actually playing in an alley somewhere, and her mother-in-law was dozing in the shade, her mouth open, snoring softly. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. Not the usual smell of the city, but something sharper, more acrid. Smoke, but not cooking smoke. The kind of smoke that comes from a real fire, heavy and thick and wrong. Elena looked up from her pot and saw a dark plume rising above the rooftops 3 or 4 streets over. Fires happened in cities, especially in summer when everything was dry, so she wasn't immediately alarmed. But then she heard shouting, not the normal market noise, but screaming, and the smoke plume got bigger, and another one appeared to the north. Stefan came running out of his workshop, his face pale. He'd climbed onto his roof to get a better view, and what he'd seen had terrified him. Multiple fires burning in different parts of the city. Too many to be accidents, too coordinated to be natural. And he'd seen men on horseback riding between the fires, men in military uniforms, men who were deliberately setting more buildings ablaze. The nagging thought tugged at the back of his mind that this was planned, that someone was doing this on purpose, but that seemed impossible. Who would burn their own city? Elena grabbed their youngest child and started calling for the others, while Stefan ran to help his mother stand. The old woman was confused, asking what all the fuss was about, and Stefan didn't have time to explain. He just picked her up, surprisingly light for all her complaining, and started toward the street. But which way to run? The smoke was coming from the west and the north. The east led toward the river, which meant crowds and chaos. South seemed clear, but for how long? Stefan made a decision and headed south, his family following, joining a growing stream of people who were all making the same calculations, all trying to escape what was rapidly becoming clear was not just a fire, but an inferno. The narrow streets turned into nightmares. Wooden houses packed close together, their walls touching, their thatched roofs separated by inches, created perfect conditions for fire to spread. And spread it did, jumping from building to building faster than people could run, creating walls of flame that blocked escape routes and forced crowds to double back, to try other streets, to panic. The heat wasn't just warm, it was physical force, pushing against you, making it hard to breathe, making every gulp of air feel like swallowing fire. Elena kept counting her children. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. A constant mantra as they ran through streets filling with smoke. Her eyes were streaming tears from the acrid air, and she could barely see 10 feet ahead. People were screaming for lost family members, for children who'd been separated in the crush. An old man fell in front of her, and the crowd trampled him before she could even think to help. The pieces weren't adding up. How could this many fires start at once? But survival left no room for questions. Some families made the fatal decision to hide in their basements, thinking they could wait out the fire, that it would pass over them and leave them safe underground. But fire doesn't work that way. As the buildings above them burned, the basements became ovens. The temperature rose so high that people suffocated from the heat before the flames ever reached them. Their lungs couldn't process air that hot. They would gasp and choke and die while the fire still raged above their heads, and when the ashes finally cooled days later, searchers would find whole families huddled together in basement corners, their skin unburned but their insides cooked. The Popescu family kept moving. Stefan's mother had stopped protesting and gone limp in his arms, either from fear or exhaustion. Elena lost one of her children's hands in the crowd and screamed until she found him again, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with terror. A church bell was ringing somewhere, a futile alarm, and the sound was almost lost in the roar of the fire, which was its own kind of beast, breathing and growling and consuming everything in its path. They made it to the southern edge of the city as the sun was setting, joining thousands of others who had escaped with nothing but their lives and whatever they were wearing. Behind them, Bucharest burned like hell itself had opened up and spilled across the earth. The flames were visible for miles, lighting up the night sky with an orange glow that would be seen from villages 2 days' journey away. The smoke column rose so high it seemed to touch the clouds, and the smell of burning wood mixed with worse things no one wanted to name but everyone recognized. By morning, when the fire finally began to run out of fuel, over 2,000 houses were gone. Dozens of churches, their painted walls and golden domes, collapsed into piles of ash and melted metal. The markets, the workshops, the mansions of the boyars, all reduced to charcoal and rubble. And in the basements, In the cellars, in the places where people had thought they'd be safe, hundreds of bodies. The exact count was never determined because some victims were burned so completely they simply became part of the ash, but estimates ranged from 500 to over 1,000 dead. The prince, who had survived because his palace was made of stone, immediately launched an investigation. And that's when the truth came out, piece by piece, through interrogations and confessions and the testimony of people who had seen mercenaries with torches. Hans Krebs and his men had set the fires deliberately, multiple ignition points spread across the city, timed to create maximum chaos. They'd done it because they hadn't been paid, because they'd been lied to, because the people who owed them money had wasted it on luxuries while soldiers starved. In that moment, it all made horrible sense. The simultaneous fires, the coordination, the way escape routes seemed deliberately blocked. This wasn't a disaster, it was murder on a massive scale. And the truly sickening part was that the money to pay the mercenaries had existed. The investigation revealed that over the previous 2 years, funds meant for military pay had been diverted to build private gardens for boyars, to fund elaborate parties, to purchase imported furniture and artwork. While the mercenaries went unpaid, officials were living like kings. Some of the mercenaries were caught. Hans Krebs himself was never found, presumably escaped to another country to sell his services to another prince. But a dozen of his men were captured and executed in the ruins of Bucharest, hanged from scaffolds built from the charred timber of the houses they'd burned. Their bodies were left hanging for weeks as a warning, though a warning of what exactly was never clear. Don't hire mercenaries you can't pay? Don't steal money meant for soldiers? Don't trust that the powerful care about anyone but themselves? Stefan and Elena Popescu rebuilt their lives slowly. They lived in a refugee camp outside the city for months, while Bucharest rose from its ashes. Stefan found work as a carpenter again, this time helping rebuild what had been destroyed. And there was bitter irony in that, building new houses to replace the ones that greed and corruption had allowed to burn. Their children grew up with nightmares about fire, about smoke, about running through streets with no escape. Stefan's mother died the following winter, and Stefan always wondered if the shock of that day had taken years off her life. The boyars who had stolen the money? Most faced no consequences. A few were fined, token punishments that meant nothing to men of their wealth. The system protected them, just as it always had, just as the mercenaries had known it would. The prince made speeches about justice and rebuilding, but the people of Bucharest knew better. They knew who was really responsible for the fire that had killed hundreds and left thousands homeless. In 2026, Bucharest is a modern city, rebuilt and rebuilt again over the centuries. But in the historical archives, in the old churches that survived, you can still find records of the Great Fire of 1800. And if you know where to look, you can find the lists of names, hundreds of them, people who died because corruption turned a natural vulnerability into a weapon. The lesson is simple, but somehow we keep forgetting it. When the powerful steal from those they owe, it's not just theft, it's murder, waiting to happen. Speaking of corruption leading to death, let's move from a burning city to a quiet bedroom, where greed within a family was about to turn even more personal and far more deliberate. In the winter of 1801, in a modest stone cottage on the outskirts of Manchester, England, a man went to bed believing his family loved him and woke up to a fire poker crashing into his skull. What the authorities initially thought was a burglary gone wrong would turn out to be something far darker, a conspiracy that had been brewing for months right under the victim's nose. The cottage sat at the end of a muddy lane, far enough from the city center that you couldn't hear the factory noise, but close enough that the smell of coal smoke from the textile mills still reached you on certain winds. It was a decent house, 2 stories, with a small garden in back and a root cellar where the family stored potatoes and turnips through the winter. The walls were thick stone, built to last, and inside it was always cool in summer and drafty in winter, no matter how much wood you burned in the fireplace. James Clough, 56 years old, had lived in that house for 23 years, ever since he'd married his wife Margaret and started working as a clerk for a textile merchant. He was the kind of man who wore the same brown wool suit every day, who counted every penny twice, who believed that thrift was next to godliness and that waste was a sin. His hair had gone gray early, and he kept it cut short to save money on barber visits. His face had settled into permanent lines of disapproval, the kind that come from years of frowning at expense reports and unnecessary expenditures. Every morning, James would wake at 5, eat a breakfast of porridge and weak tea, and walk the 3 miles to his office in the city. He carried the same leather satchel his father had used, patched and repatched, until more of it was patches than original leather. At work, he sat at a high desk, copying figures into ledgers, his handwriting small and precise, never wasting a drop of ink. His colleagues found him cold, distant, the kind of man who would calculate the cost of a friendly conversation and decide it wasn't worth the time. But where James truly excelled was in managing his household budget. He gave his wife Margaret an allowance each week for food and necessities, an amount so small she had to stretch it like a miser to make it last. No meat except on Sundays, and then only the cheapest cuts. Candles were rationed, 1 per room per evening. Coal for the fire was measured carefully, and if Margaret used too much, James would notice and deduct it from next week's allowance. He kept detailed records of every farthing spent, and woe to anyone who couldn't account for a missing penny. Margaret Clough, 49 years old, had endured this for over 2 decades. She was a thin woman, worn down by years of making do with too little, her hands rough from washing clothes in cold water because hot water meant extra coal to heat it. Her dresses were patched and faded, and she wore the same bonnet year after year because James refused to spend money on what he called frivolous items. She'd learned long ago not to ask for anything, not to complain, not to show any displeasure with her situation, but inside, resentment had been building like pressure in a sealed kettle. Their son, Thomas, 24 years old, still lived at home because James charged him such high rent that he couldn't save enough to move out. Thomas worked in the same textile office as his father, copying the same endless columns of numbers, and James paid him less than half what the other clerks earned because, as James put it, a son should be grateful for the opportunity to learn from his father. Thomas had watched his mother go without, had seen his father's cruelty disguised as frugality, and had developed a hatred that ran deep as marrow. What the neighbors saw was a respectable family, quiet and proper. James walking to work each morning, Margaret tending her small garden, Thomas coming and going with his head down. They seemed like good Christian people, the kind who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. But behind the thick stone walls of that cottage, a different story was unfolding. It started in the autumn of 1800 when Margaret fell ill with a fever that left her weak for weeks. She needed medicine, needed better food to regain her strength, but James refused to spend the money. He told her to rest and drink water, that doctors were charlatans who charged too much for useless advice. Margaret recovered eventually, but something had shifted. She'd come close to dying because her husband valued money more than her life, and that realization crystallized everything she'd felt for years into something sharp and dangerous. She started talking to Thomas, careful conversations when James was at work, about how different their lives could be. She'd mentioned casually that James had savings, quite a bit actually, money he'd been hoarding for decades. Thomas already knew this, had seen the lockbox his father kept in his bedroom, had watched his father count coins late at night like a dragon counting treasure. Margaret would sigh and say it was a shame that money just sat there doing nothing when it could improve their lives, could give Thomas the chance to start his own life, could give her a few comfortable years before she was too old to enjoy them. These conversations happened over months, little seeds planted and watered until they grew into a plan. Neither of them said it directly at first. They danced around it, talking about what would happen when James died naturally, how much easier things would be, how they could finally live like normal people instead of misers. But eventually, the unspoken became spoken. What if James died sooner rather than later? What if an accident happened? What if someone helped that accident along? The plan they settled on was simple. Make it look like a burglary. Someone breaks in during the night, James wakes up and confronts them, gets killed in the struggle. The burglar panics and flees without taking anything. It happens all the time in the city, so why not in a cottage on the outskirts? The authorities would investigate, find nothing, and eventually move on. Margaret would inherit everything, Thomas would get his share, and they'd finally escape the grinding poverty James had imposed on them, despite having the means to live comfortably. On the night of December 14th, 1801, the plan went into motion. James had his usual sparse dinner, bread and cheese and water, while Margaret and Thomas ate in silence across from him. James reviewed his account books after dinner, made a few notations, and then announced he was going to bed at 8 o'clock, as he always did. Margaret and Thomas sat by the fire for another hour, not speaking, just waiting. At 9 o'clock, Margaret went upstairs and checked on James. He was asleep, snoring softly, lying on his back in the same position he always slept in. She came back downstairs and nodded to Thomas. Her throat tightened, breath catching, but she pushed the fear down. They'd come too far to stop now. Thomas stood up, picked up the fire poker from beside the hearth, and felt its weight. Cast iron, heavy, with a pointed end for stirring coals. It would do. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking slightly despite his care. The bedroom door was open, and in the faint moonlight coming through the window, he could see his father's shape under the blankets. Thomas stood there for a long moment, the poker in his hand, thinking about all the years of penny pinching, all the times he'd gone hungry while his father counted money, all the casual cruelties disguised as lessons about the value of thrift. The first blow caught James on the side of the head as he slept. His eyes flew open, and he tried to sit up, tried to understand what was happening, but Thomas hit him again before he could speak. And again, and again, the sound was terrible, a wet cracking that echoed in the small room, and James's attempts to cry out became gurgles as blood filled his mouth. He raised his hands weakly, trying to protect himself, and Thomas broke his fingers with the poker before delivering the final blow that caved in the front of James's skull. When it was over, Thomas stood there shaking, the poker dripping blood onto the wooden floor. His father lay motionless, the blankets soaked dark, and the smell in the room was copper and something else, something that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. He'd expected to feel triumphant, liberated, but instead he just felt sick. Margaret appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and went pale. But she didn't scream. She didn't run. She walked to the bed, checked that James was truly dead, and then turned to Thomas and said they needed to make it look convincing. They staged the scene carefully, knocked over a chair, scattered some of James's belongings, made it look like there had been a struggle. They opened a window in the parlor to suggest the burglar's entry point. Margaret cut her own arm with a kitchen knife, a shallow wound that bled impressively, and tore her nightgown to suggest she'd fought with the intruder. Thomas hid the poker in the root cellar, planning to dispose of it later. Then they waited an hour to make the timing right, and at midnight, Margaret ran screaming into the street, crying for help, saying her husband had been murdered by a burglar who'd broken in while they slept. Neighbors came running, and someone fetched the night watchman. And soon, the cottage was full of people examining the scene, comforting the distraught widow and her shocked son. The investigation started immediately. The local constable, a man named William Fletcher, who'd worked dozens of burglaries, walked through the house looking at everything. He noted the open window, the scattered belongings, the defensive wounds on Margaret's arm. He examined James's body, saw the massive head trauma, counted at least 8 separate impacts. He interviewed Margaret, who tearfully explained that she'd heard a noise downstairs, woken her son, and they'd both come down to investigate, only to find a man in their parlor. James had come down too, had confronted the burglar, and been struck down. Margaret claimed she'd tried to fight the man off, which explained her injury, but he'd pushed her aside and fled through the window. Thomas corroborated the story. He said he'd arrived downstairs just as the man was climbing out the window, too late to see his face or give chase. Both of them claimed they'd heard nothing during the actual murder, despite it happening in the room directly above where Margaret slept and next to where Thomas's room was. When asked about this, Margaret explained that James always kept his door closed and the stone walls were thick. It was plausible enough. But Fletcher was troubled. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. Burglars usually took things, but nothing was missing. The lockbox full of money sat undisturbed in James's bedroom. Silver candlesticks in the parlor were still there. Even James's good pocket watch, lying on his nightstand, hadn't been touched, and the wound pattern bothered him. 8 blows to the head delivered with enough force to break bone suggested rage more than a panicked burglar trying to escape. He interviewed the neighbors. Had anyone seen a stranger in the area, heard anything unusual, seen anyone running from the cottage? The answers were all negative. The lane was quiet that night. Nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything. For a violent murder involving a struggle and screaming, it was remarkably unwitnessed. Fletcher went back to the cottage and looked at the open window more carefully. There was no mud on the sill, which was strange because it had rained 2 days before and the ground outside was still damp. A man climbing through would have left marks. The chair that was supposedly knocked over in the struggle was positioned oddly, like someone had placed it on its side rather than it falling naturally. And when he examined the blood splatter in the bedroom, it was all concentrated around the bed, with none of the scattered spray you'd expect from someone being beaten while moving around the room fighting back. He brought Margaret and Thomas in for more questioning, this time separately. He asked them to go through the story again, looking for inconsistencies, and he found them. Margaret said the burglar had pushed her down the stairs. Thomas said the burglar had pushed past him in the hallway. Neither of those things could be true if the burglar had gone out the window. When confronted with this discrepancy, both of them got flustered, changed their stories slightly, tried to explain it as confusion from the shock. Fletcher pressed harder. He asked Thomas about his relationship with his father. Thomas said it was fine, normal, nothing unusual, but Fletcher had talked to people who worked with both of them, and they painted a different picture. James Clough was known as a tyrant who underpaid his own son and treated him like a servant. Fletcher asked Margaret about her marriage, and she gave the expected answers about love and respect, but her hands shook as she spoke, and her eyes wouldn't meet his. The breakthrough came from a maid who worked in a house down the lane. She told Fletcher that she'd seen Margaret and Thomas having intense conversations in the garden over the past few months. Conversations that stopped abruptly whenever anyone came near. She'd thought it odd at the time, but hadn't connected it to anything sinister. Fletcher realized what he was looking at. Not a burglary at all, but a murder conspiracy. Carefully planned, but poorly executed. He arrested both of them on suspicion of murder. At first, they maintained their innocence, stuck to their story. But Fletcher had the poker found in the root cellar, still with traces of blood and hair on it. He had the inconsistencies in their testimonies. He had the lack of any actual burglary. And he had a motive, the years of abuse and the promise of inheritance. Under interrogation, Thomas broke first. He was young, inexperienced with lying, and the guilt was eating him alive. He confessed everything. The months of planning, his mother's role in convincing him, the actual murder. He showed no remorse for killing James, but seemed genuinely disturbed by how it had felt, by the reality of beating his father to death versus the abstract idea they'd discussed. When asked why he'd done it, he said simply, because James was frugal to the point of cruelty, because years of unnecessary suffering had made them desperate, because the money existed to make their lives bearable, but James preferred to hoard it like a miser. Margaret confessed too, once she knew Thomas had already talked. She admitted to planning it, to suggesting it, to helping stage the scene. But she tried to paint herself as the real victim, a woman driven to desperation by decades of abuse, of being denied basic necessities, while her husband sat on a pile of savings. She cried during her confession, but whether from genuine remorse or fear of the noose was unclear. Their trial was held in March of 1802 and lasted 3 days. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the confessions, the motive. The defense tried to argue that James's cruelty had driven them to it, that it was a kind of self-defense against years of abuse. But English law in 1801 didn't recognize financial abuse as justification for murder, and the jury took less than an hour to find both defendants guilty. Thomas Clough was hanged on April 23, 1802. He was 24 years old. His last words were an apology to his father, though whether he was apologizing for the murder or for getting caught, no one could say. Margaret Clough's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to her age and sex, and she died in prison 12 years later, never having spent a day enjoying the money she'd killed for. James Clough's savings, the money that had cost 3 lives, was seized by the Crown to pay for the trial and execution. What remained, about £40, was donated to the local poorhouse, where it fed and clothed dozens of people who actually needed it. The bitter irony is that if James had simply been less miserly, if he'd treated his family with basic decency, he'd have lived to old age and died in his bed, surrounded by people who tolerated him. Instead, his obsession with hoarding money turned his own family into killers. The cottage stood empty for years after that. People said it was cursed, that you could still hear the sound of the poker striking bone if you walked past at night. Eventually, it was torn down and the land sold, and now there's a row of modern houses where the Clough cottage once stood. But in the Manchester court records, the case is still referenced in law textbooks as an example of how financial abuse, while morally wrong, doesn't legally justify murder, and how sometimes the people sleeping under the same roof are the ones you should fear most. Greed within a family is one thing, but what about greed for its own sake? Our next story takes us to Paris, where a woman turned murder into a profitable business, and where her weapon of choice was as elegant as it was brutal. In the fashionable salons of Paris during the early 1800s, Madame Céleste Deschaze was known as a tragic figure, a beautiful widow who had suffered the misfortune of losing 3 husbands in less than 2 years. Society ladies would pat her hand and murmur their sympathies while secretly thanking God it wasn't them. What none of them knew was that Madame Deschaze wasn't unlucky at all. She was methodical, patient, and extremely good at murder. Paris in 1800 was a city rebuilding itself after the chaos of the Revolution. The guillotines had stopped running, Napoleon was consolidating power, and the wealthy were cautiously emerging from hiding to reclaim their place in society. The Rue Saint-Honoré, where Madame Deschaze kept her elegant townhouse, was lined with shops selling imported silks and fine porcelain, with cafes where philosophers argued over tiny cups of bitter coffee, with the kind of people who measured their worth in titles and property and the cut of their clothes. Madame Deschaze's townhouse was a 3-story affair with cream-colored stone walls and tall windows that let in the afternoon light. Inside, everything spoke of refined taste and comfortable wealth. Persian carpets covered polished floors, oil paintings in gilded frames hung on silk wallpaper, and the parlor smelled perpetually of lavender sachets and beeswax furniture polish. Fresh flowers appeared on the mantelpiece every 3 days, and the silver tea service was so polished you could see your face in it. Céleste Deschaze herself, 32 years old in the spring of 1801, was the kind of woman men noticed and women envied. She had pale skin that she protected obsessively from the sun, dark hair she wore in the latest Parisian fashion, and green eyes that seemed to sparkle with amusement at some private joke. She dressed in the finest fabrics, wore jewelry that caught the light, and moved through rooms with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how beautiful she was and precisely how to use it. Her first husband, Monsieur Philippe Moreau, had been a wine merchant twice her age when they married in 1799. He was wealthy, but boring, the kind of man who talked endlessly about barrel aging and grape varietals, while his young wife smiled politely and counted the hours until she could escape to more interesting company. Philippe adored Céleste, showered her with gifts, and promised that his considerable fortune would be hers when he died, which he assumed would be many years in the future. He was wrong about that. Philippe developed stomach troubles in the autumn of 1799, just 6 months after the wedding. It started mild, some discomfort after meals, occasional nausea. But over the course of a few weeks, it got worse. He couldn't keep food down, lost weight rapidly, and complained of burning pain that made him double over. Doctors were called, and they diagnosed it as stomach vapors, a catch-all term for digestive problems nobody really understood. They prescribed rest and bland foods, neither of which helped. Céleste played the devoted wife beautifully. She sat by Philippe's bedside, brought him weak tea and broth, held a cool cloth to his forehead when he was feverish. The servants whispered about how lucky Monsieur Moreau was to have such a caring spouse. In early December, Philippe signed a new will, leaving everything to Céleste, wanting to ensure she'd be provided for. 2 days later, he died screaming in agony, his stomach finally giving out completely. The doctor who examined him noted severe internal bleeding and signed the death certificate without suspicion. Rich old men died of stomach problems all the time. Celeste mourned appropriately, wore black for the required period, and inherited a fortune in wine, inventory, and property. She sold most of it quickly, keeping only the townhouse and enough invested funds to live comfortably. And then, after a respectful 8 months, she began accepting suitors again. Several men courted her, attracted by her beauty and the aura of tragic romance that surrounded her. But the one she chose was Monsieur Laurent Dubois, a banker 15 years her senior with even more money than Philippe had possessed. They married in September of 1800, a quiet ceremony with just a few witnesses. Laurent was different from Philippe, more energetic, more demanding of her attention. He wanted a companion as well as a wife, someone to accompany him to the opera, to host dinner parties, to be seen on his arm at important social events. Celeste obliged, playing her role perfectly, but privately she found Laurent exhausting. He was also, inconveniently, in excellent health. That changed in November. Laurent began experiencing the same symptoms Philippe had, starting with mild stomach discomfort and escalating to severe pain and vomiting. He joked at first that perhaps Celeste's cooking didn't agree with him, though of course Celeste didn't cook, the servants did. But the joke stopped when he couldn't get out of bed, when every meal came back up, when his skin took on a grayish pallor that alarmed everyone who saw him. Different doctors were called this time, more expensive ones, and they poked and prodded and prescribed various treatments, none of which worked. Laurent deteriorated rapidly, much faster than Philippe had, and by early December he was barely conscious, his body racked with pain. Celeste had made sure he signed papers, giving her access to his accounts before he became too ill to hold a pen. On December 18, 1800, Laurent Dubois died in the same bed where Philippe Moreau had died a year earlier. The doctors listed the cause as acute stomach inflammation and expressed sympathy to the twice-widowed Madame de Chaise. This time, society began to whisper. One husband dying of stomach troubles was unfortunate. 2 was suspicious. But nobody said anything directly to Celeste, because what could they say? The doctors had found nothing wrong, no evidence of foul play, just 2 men who developed fatal digestive problems. Celeste mourned again, dressed in black again, and attended Mass, where the priest spoke of God's mysterious ways and the trials he sends to test us. But Celeste wasn't being tested. She was winning. Laurent's fortune was even larger than Philippe's, and now she had wealth enough to live exactly as she pleased for the rest of her life. Except that living exactly as she pleased apparently meant doing it again, because in March of 1801, just 3 months after Laurent's death, she began accepting calls from Monsieur Henri Fontaine, a textile manufacturer who owned factories in Lyon and a mansion in Paris. Henri was younger than her previous husbands, only 42, and he was besotted with Celeste in a way that would have been embarrassing if it wasn't so useful. He proposed within a month, offering her not just his fortune, but his name, his status, his complete devotion. They married in May of 1801, and Henri moved into the townhouse on Rue Saint-Honoré, into the bedroom where 2 men before him had died. The society ladies had stopped offering sympathy by now. They were openly scandalized that Celeste would marry again so quickly, and rumors flew about what kind of woman would go through husbands like dresses. But Henri didn't care what people said. He was in love, and he spent his wedding night making plans for their future together, talking about the children they'd have, the trips they'd take to Italy and Greece. Celeste listened and smiled and poured him tea from her porcelain service, the same service she'd used for Philippe and Laurent. The same delicate cups with the painted roses, the same sugar bowl with the silver spoon. Henri drank 3 cups that night, complimenting her on the quality of the tea leaves, saying he'd never tasted anything quite like it. By morning, he was violently ill. The symptoms were familiar to Celeste by now. She'd seen them twice before. The vomiting, the pain, the rapid deterioration. But Henri was younger and stronger, and he fought it longer than the others had. For 2 weeks, he suffered, growing weaker each day but clinging stubbornly to life. Doctors came and went, and one of them, a young physician named Dr. Beaumont, started asking questions that made Celeste nervous. Dr. Beaumont noticed that Henri's symptoms were consistent with poisoning, not disease. He observed that Henri seemed worse after drinking tea or eating meals prepared specifically for him, and better when he consumed nothing but water. He also learned about Celeste's previous two husbands and their similar deaths. Dr. Beaumont began to suspect what everyone else had whispered about but been too polite to voice. Madame Deschaise was killing her husbands. On June 7, 1801, Dr. Beaumont arrived for his daily visit to find Henri sipping tea from a porcelain cup, with Celeste sitting beside him urging him to drink it all, saying it would help settle his stomach. Dr. Beaumont asked to examine the tea, and Celeste's face went pale. She said it was just tea, nothing special, but her hand trembled slightly as she set down the cup she'd been holding. Dr. Beaumont took the cup Henri had been drinking from and held it up to the light. At the bottom, barely visible, was a fine white powder that hadn't fully dissolved. He asked Celeste what it was, and she claimed it was sugar that had settled. But sugar dissolves in hot tea, and this powder was sitting at the bottom like sediment in wine. Dr. Beaumont said he was taking the cup for analysis and suggested that Henri stop consuming anything Celeste offered him. Henri, even in his weakened state, understood what was being implied. His wife, the woman he'd married just weeks ago, the woman he'd trusted completely, had been poisoning him. Every nerve in his body screamed danger, and for the first time since he'd gotten sick, he looked at Celeste not with love, but with fear. He asked her directly if she'd put something in his tea, and the way she hesitated, the way her eyes flickered away from his, told him everything he needed to know. Dr. Beaumont called for the police, and Celeste Deschaise was arrested in her own parlor, still wearing the expensive silk dress she'd bought with her second husband's money. The cup was analyzed by a chemist, who found not one poison, but two. Belladonna, a plant extract that causes nausea, vomiting, and eventually organ failure. And crushed glass, ground so fine it was almost powder, designed to tear the stomach lining and cause internal bleeding that would make the poisoning look like natural stomach inflammation. It was brilliant, actually, in a horrible way. The belladonna would cause symptoms that seemed like disease, while the crushed glass would create physical damage that doctors would interpret as the cause rather than a symptom. The glass would tear the stomach from the inside, creating wounds that would bleed and hurt and mimic the effects of ulcers or inflammation. And the belladonna would mask some of the pain while accelerating the death, making it seem like a particularly aggressive case of stomach trouble rather than murder. When confronted with the evidence, Celeste initially denied everything. She claimed someone must have tampered with her tea service, that perhaps a servant had done it. But when police searched her townhouse, they found more belladonna hidden in a hat box in her bedroom and a small jar of powdered glass in her vanity drawer mixed with her face powders. They also found detailed records of her husband's finances, including documents she'd forged to access their accounts before they were dead. The truth hit investigators like revelation. Celeste had married Philippe for his money, killed him when he'd signed over his fortune, and then repeated the process with Laurent and attempted it with Henri. She'd perfected her method with the first two, learning the right dosages, the right timing. The crushed glass was her innovation, her way of creating physical evidence of stomach disease that would satisfy doctors who might otherwise be suspicious. Under interrogation, Celeste finally confessed, though she showed no remorse. She explained her reasoning coldly, like she was discussing a business transaction. Old men married young, beautiful women, expecting companionship and maybe an heir? She'd provided the first and had no intention of providing the second. Why should she waste years of her life waiting for them to die naturally when she could accelerate the process and move on to the next fortune? She'd done nothing, she claimed, that men didn't do to women all the time, using them for their youth and beauty. She'd simply reversed the transaction. The trial was sensational. All of Paris talked about the Black Widow of Rue Saint-Honoré, the woman who'd murdered 3 husbands, or attempted to, with poison and crushed glass. The prosecution brought in Henri Fontaine, still weak but recovering now that he was no longer being poisoned, to testify about his wife's deception. They exhumed the bodies of Philippe Moreau and Laurent Dubois, and chemists found traces of belladonna in their remains, along with evidence of severe internal lacerations consistent with ground glass consumption. Celesta's defense argued that she was a product of a society that gave women no power except through marriage, that she'd been driven to desperate acts by a system that treated wives as property. But the jury wasn't sympathetic to a woman who'd callously murdered two men and attempted to kill a third purely for financial gain. They found her guilty on all counts after less than an hour of deliberation. Madame Celeste Deschaze was executed by guillotine on August 23, 1801, in the same Place de la Révolution where thousands had died during the Terror. Unlike those victims, she died for her own crimes rather than political ones. She walked to the scaffold calmly, dressed in a simple white shift, and her last words were reportedly, "I regret nothing except getting caught." Which tells you everything you need to know about who she really was beneath the beautiful face and elegant manners. Henri Fontaine survived and eventually remarried, this time to a woman his own age who had no interest in his money because she had plenty of her own. The townhouse on Rue Saint-Honoré was sold, and the new owners reported no ghosts, no spirits, just rooms that smelled faintly of lavender no matter how many times they aired them out. The porcelain tea service was destroyed, every cup and saucer smashed and buried, because some objects carry too much death to ever be used again. In 2026, poisoning is harder to get away with because we have toxicology tests and forensic science and autopsies that catch what 19th century doctors missed. But the fundamental truth remains. The most dangerous person in your life is often the one sharing your bed, the one you trust completely, the one who knows exactly how you take your tea. Poison is quiet, elegant, the weapon of someone who wants to kill without confrontation. But some evil isn't quiet at all. Some evil screams its presence, announces itself with violence in the streets, and dares anyone to stop it. Which brings us to London in the fog, where wealthy young men turned hunting humans into sport. On foggy nights in London during the early 1800s, women learned to stay indoors after dark, not because of footpads or common thieves, but because of something far worse: gangs of wealthy young men who hunted human prey for entertainment. They called themselves the Mohawks, after the Mohawk warriors of America, and what they did to their victims was so twisted that even 2 centuries later, it's hard to believe it really happened. London in 1801 was a city of extreme contrasts. The wealthy lived in grand townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia, with servants and carriages and lives of complete leisure. The poor crammed into rookeries in the East End, whole families sharing single rooms, working 16-hour days in factories that poisoned them slowly. And between these two worlds, at night, in the fog that rolled up from the Thames and turned the streets into a maze of shadows, the sons of the wealthy came out to play their sick games. The fog itself was a living thing in London, thick and yellowish from coal smoke, smelling of sulfur and whetstone and the river's rot. It would settle over the city like a blanket, reducing visibility to a few feet, muffling sounds, turning familiar streets into alien landscapes. Street lamps created small islands of weak light that barely penetrated the murk, and between them was darkness so complete you could walk past someone and never know they were there. It was perfect hunting weather. The Mohawks typically operated in groups of 5 to 8, young men ranging from 18 to 25, all from aristocratic families with names that appeared in Burke's Peerage. They dressed in expensive clothes, carried silver-topped walking sticks, and spoke with the refined accents of Eton and Oxford. During the day, they were respectable members of society. At night, they became monsters. Their favorite targets were women traveling alone, particularly young servants walking home after working late at the houses of the wealthy. These girls couldn't afford sedan chairs or carriages, so they walked, often for miles, through dark streets, trying to get home before the worst of the night descended. They were vulnerable, isolated, and most importantly, they had no power, no connections, no way to seek justice if something happened to them. Sarah Mitchell was 19 years old, a housemaid in a Belgravia townhouse, when she encountered the Mohawks on a November night in 1801. She'd been kept late, scrubbing floors, and it was past 10 when she finally left through the servants' entrance and started the long walk to her lodging house in Southwark. The fog was particularly thick that night, and she kept to the main streets where she could, walking quickly, her shawl pulled tight against the damp cold. She heard them before she saw them, male voices, laughing, the sound echoing strangely in the fog. Sarah's first instinct was to hide, to duck into a doorway until they passed, because women knew that groups of drunk men at night meant trouble. But she hesitated too long, and suddenly they were there, materializing out of the fog like ghosts, surrounding her in a loose circle that blocked her escape in every direction. There were 6 of them, all young, all well-dressed, and all wearing masks made of black silk that covered the upper halves of their faces. The leader, a tall man with expensive boots and a walking stick with a silver wolf's head handle, looked her up and down and smiled. He asked if she was out for an evening stroll, his tone mocking, and the others laughed. Sarah tried to walk past them, saying she needed to get home, but they closed the circle tighter. What happened next would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. The men grabbed her, not violently at first, but firm enough that she couldn't break free, and announced that she was going to dance for them. They called it sweating, and it was one of their favorite games. They forced Sarah to dance, to twirl and jump and move continuously while they stood in a circle, clapping and laughing and making crude comments about her appearance. When she tried to stop, they would poke her with their walking sticks, hard enough to bruise, until she started moving again. They made her dance for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes. Her legs were shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat soaking through her dress despite the cold. She begged them to stop, begged them to let her go, but they just laughed harder. One of them suggested they make her dance naked, and Sarah felt something cold and heavy press on her chest, a terror so complete that her vision started to gray at the edges. But then someone shouted from down the street, a man's voice calling out to ask what was happening, and the Mohawks scattered like rats. They vanished into the fog as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving Sarah collapsed on the cobblestones, sobbing and gasping for air. The man who'd shouted, a night watchman making his rounds, helped her up and asked if she was hurt. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. The watchman walked her to a main street and told her to go straight home, which she did, looking over her shoulder every few steps. Sarah wasn't the first victim, and she wouldn't be the last. Around the same time, a woman named Elizabeth Harper had an even worse encounter. Elizabeth was 23, a seamstress who worked late to meet deadlines, and she was walking home through a residential area when she heard footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace, but the footsteps matched her speed, and then there were more footsteps in front of her, and she realized she was being herded. The Mohawks appeared from side streets, cutting off her escape routes, and this group had a different game in mind. They had a sedan chair, one of those enclosed boxes on poles that wealthy people used for transport, and they tipped it over in front of Elizabeth and told her to get in. When she refused, they grabbed her and forced her inside, then tipped the chair upright with her trapped in it. The door was jammed shut from the outside, and Elizabeth was sealed in darkness, unable to see, barely able to breathe. What the Mohawks did then was even more vile. They rocked the chair violently, tipping it back and forth, slamming it against walls and lampposts while Elizabeth screamed inside. They reached through the small windows and grabbed at her, tearing her dress, touching her in ways that made her skin crawl. Elizabeth could hear them laughing, could hear them making bets about what they would do to her next, and she genuinely believed she was going to die in that chair, suffocated or beaten to death for the amusement of men who saw her as nothing more than an object for their entertainment. The attack only stopped when a group of dock workers heard the commotion and came to investigate. The Mohawks fled, as they always did when confronted by anyone who might fight back, leaving the sedan chair on its side in the street with Elizabeth trapped inside. The dock workers pried open the door and found her hysterical, her dress torn, her face bleeding from where she'd been struck through the window. One of the men recognized her and walked her home, and Elizabeth's father, a blacksmith with a temper, went straight to the magistrate to file a complaint. But here's where the true evil of the situation reveals itself. The magistrate, a man named Sir Thomas Bellingham, listened to the complaint with apparent sympathy. He took notes, he asked questions, he assured Elizabeth's father that the perpetrators would be found and punished, and then he did absolutely nothing. Because Sir Thomas knew exactly who the Mohawks were. His own son was one of them. The Mohawks weren't just random thugs. They were the sons of judges, of members of parliament, of wealthy merchants, and landowners who controlled the legal system. When victims tried to report attacks, they found themselves filing complaints with the fathers and uncles of the men who'd assaulted them. The investigating magistrates would promise action, then quietly close the cases. Witnesses would be intimidated into silence. Victims would be told there wasn't enough evidence, or that they'd misidentified their attackers, or that boys will be boys and no real harm was done. A maid named Catherine Price learned this the hard way when she tried to seek justice after being attacked by the Mohawks. They'd cornered her in an alley and performed what they called tipping, where they would flip women's skirts over their heads and hold them there while making lewd comments and groping them. Catherine managed to tear off one attacker's mask during the struggle, and she got a clear look at his face. She recognized him as the son of a local alderman, a man she'd seen at church, at social gatherings, someone whose family employed her sister. Catherine went to the authorities with this information, certain that identifying one of the attackers would lead to justice. Instead, she found herself accused of lying, of trying to slander a respectable young man for attention or money. The alderman's son had alibis, witnesses who swore he'd been elsewhere that night. Catherine's employer was pressured to dismiss her for making false accusations, and she lost her job and her reputation. The message was clear. Victims of the Mohawks had no recourse, no protection, no hope of justice. The newspapers occasionally mentioned the attacks, but always in vague terms, referring to gangs of miscreants or unknown assailants. Never naming names, never pointing fingers at the families everyone knew were responsible. Because those families controlled the newspapers too, through advertising revenue and social pressure, and the understanding that certain stories simply didn't get printed if you wanted to stay in business. By the spring of 1802, the attacks had become so common that women in London were organizing their own defense. They would walk in groups after dark, carrying hat pins and scissors and anything else that might be used as a weapon. Some households started arranging for male servants to escort their female staff home at night. Churches held special meetings to discuss the problem, and priests preached about the moral decay of the upper classes, but nothing changed because the people with the power to change things were protecting their own sons. One attack in particular brought the issue to a head, though not in a way that led to justice. A young woman named Anne Winters was walking home after visiting her sick mother when the Mohawks grabbed her and dragged her into a park. What they did to her there crossed the line from assault into something even darker. They beat her severely, broke her arm, and committed acts of sexual violence that left her traumatized and pregnant. Anne's injuries were so severe she couldn't work for months, and when she finally recovered physically, she was never the same mentally. Anne's father, a carpenter with more courage than sense, managed to identify 3 of the attackers through a combination of investigation and bribery. He brought this information to the authorities along with Anne's testimony and physical evidence of the assault. Surely, he thought, with this much proof, justice would be served. But he'd underestimated how thoroughly the system protected its own. The 3 young men he'd identified were sons of a baron, a judge, and a wealthy textile merchant. They were questioned, certainly, but in the comfort of their homes rather than in custody. They admitted to being in the park that night, but claimed they'd encountered Anne and found her already injured, possibly attacked by footpads, and they'd actually tried to help her. Anne was lying, they said, trying to trap respectable men into marriage or extort money from their families. And because they were who they were, because their fathers were who they were, their version of events was accepted as truth. Anne's father was warned that if he continued making accusations, he would be arrested for libel. Anne herself was branded a liar and worse. The family had to move to a different part of the city to escape the harassment, and the 3 young men who'd brutalized her faced no consequences at all. They continued their lives of leisure, continued their nighttime activities, continued hunting women in the fog with the absolute certainty that they would never be held accountable. The Mohawks operated with impunity in London for several years, from around 1800 to 1804, when changing social attitudes and increasing public pressure finally made their activities too scandalous to ignore. But even then, there were no arrests, no trials, no punishments. The gang simply stopped using the name Mohawks and became more discreet. The attacks didn't end, they just became less organized, less public. Of the dozens of documented attacks, of the hundreds that likely went unreported, not a single Mohawk was ever successfully prosecuted. Some of them grew up to become judges themselves, MPs, leaders of society, men who made laws they'd spent their youth breaking. Sarah Mitchell, the housemaid, forced to dance until she collapsed, emigrated to America in 1805, unable to live in a city where she might encounter her attackers at any moment. Elizabeth Harper, trapped in the sedan chair, developed a fear of enclosed spaces that stayed with her for life. Catherine Price, who lost her job for telling the truth, died in a workhouse at age 37. Anne Winters took her own life in 1808, unable to escape the trauma of what had been done to her. In 2026, we like to think we've progressed beyond the days when wealthy criminals could act with impunity because of who their fathers were. But the truth is, institutional protection of the powerful is alive and well. The details change, the methods evolve, but the fundamental reality remains. Some people commit crimes knowing they'll never face consequences because the system was built to protect them, and the people harmed by their actions are considered acceptable losses in maintaining the social order. What happens when monsters aren't hiding in the shadows but walking openly in society, protected by the very institutions meant to stop them? That's not a historical question. That's the question we're still struggling to answer. And maybe the most frightening thing is knowing that right now, somewhere, someone is getting away with something terrible because they have the right last name. But at least those villagers in Russia believed in monsters. They believed evil could take physical form, which made what they did to the man they caught both horrifying and, in a strange way, understandable. The merchant was still alive when they found him, though calling what remained of him alive was generous. His horse had been torn apart, literally ripped into pieces that were scattered across 50 yards of frozen ground. And the merchant himself had been dragged from the saddle and savaged by something with claws and teeth, his throat opened, his belly slit, his face so mutilated that his own wife wouldn't have recognized him. But his eyes were still moving, still aware. And when the search party approached, he tried to speak, blood bubbling from his ruined throat, forming words that sounded like beast and wolf and run. This was the Ural Mountains in the winter of 1800, where the Russian wilderness stretched for thousands of miles in every direction, and civilization was just small islands of human settlement in an ocean of frozen forest. The wind that came down from the north carried the smell of pine and ice and something older, something that made even hardened frontiersmen uneasy. Wolves were common in these mountains, bears too, but what had been attacking travelers along the trade routes for the past 6 months was something different. The attacks had started in the summer of 1800, when a fur trapper named Dmitry Volkov disappeared on his way to the trading post at Yekaterinburg. His companions found his campsite torn apart, his tent shredded, and a trail of blood leading into the forest that they were too afraid to follow. They assumed a bear had gotten him, though bears typically didn't hunt humans and certainly didn't destroy campsites with such apparent fury. Dmitry's body was never found. 3 weeks later, a family traveling by wagon was attacked at dusk. The father was killed instantly, his head nearly separated from his body. The mother and children managed to flee into the forest and hide until morning, and when they emerged and found help, they told a story that nobody wanted to believe. They said the thing that attacked them had walked on 2 legs like a man but was covered in hair, had claws instead of fingers, and had eyes that glowed yellow in the firelight. The authorities assumed the family was in shock, that they'd seen a bear standing upright, as bears sometimes do, and that fear had transformed the memory into something more monstrous. But then more people went missing. A hunter here, a merchant there, a group of soldiers on patrol who simply never returned to their garrison. Search parties would find torn clothing, scattered belongings, and always blood. Sometimes they'd find body parts, an arm here, a leg there, gnawed on and discarded like a predator had been feeding but wasn't hungry enough to finish the meal. The pattern was clear. Something was hunting humans along a 30-mile stretch of the trade route that ran through the mountains. The local villagers started calling it the Wolf of the Steppes, though the Ural Mountains weren't steppes at all. The name stuck anyway. probably because it sounded better than admitting they had no idea what was killing people. Travelers began moving in large armed groups, and even then, they only traveled during daylight hours. The trade route that had once seen dozens of merchants per week was nearly abandoned, and the villages that depended on that trade were suffering. In October of 1800, a Cossack military unit was dispatched to hunt down whatever was responsible for the attacks. 20 experienced soldiers, all of them veterans of campaigns against Chechen rebels and Turkish raiders, men who knew how to track and fight. They spent 2 weeks combing the mountains, following old blood trails, checking caves and ravines, finding nothing but the remains of victims. And then, on the 15th night, the thing found them. The attack came during the darkest hour before dawn, when the Cossacks were camped in a clearing with sentries posted. One of the sentries screamed, a sound that was cut off mid-breath, and then chaos erupted. The soldiers scrambled from their bedrolls to find something moving through their camp with impossible speed, a shape that seemed to blend with the shadows, striking and retreating before anyone could get a clear look. By the time they managed to organize a defense, 3 men were dead and 2 more were wounded, including the unit commander who'd had his shoulder opened by claws or a knife or something in between. The survivors described seeing a man, or something shaped like a man, covered in matted fur or hair or filthy rags. They couldn't agree on which. It moved like no human they'd ever seen, leaping over obstacles, climbing a tree to escape when they finally surrounded it, disappearing into the canopy with a howl that sounded half human and half animal. The Cossacks, hardened men who'd faced death in battle countless times, refused to pursue it into the forest at night. They waited for dawn, tended their wounded, and when light finally came, they found tracks leading away from the camp. Not paw prints, but boot prints, human boot prints, mixed with drag marks like whoever made them was limping or injured. They followed the trail for hours, moving cautiously, weapons ready. The tracks led deeper into the mountains, to areas so remote that even the hunters avoided them, places where the forest grew so thick the sun barely reached the ground, and the silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a raven. And there, in a limestone cliff face, they found a cave, and in that cave, they found a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cave was maybe 30 feet deep, with a ceiling low enough that a tall man would have to stoop. The floor was covered in bones, human bones mixed with animal bones, skulls arranged in piles like someone had been collecting them. The walls were covered in crude drawings made with charcoal and what looked like dried blood, images of wolves and moons and stick figures being torn apart. And in the back of the cave, surrounded by the belongings of at least 15 different people, clothes and boots and satchels and jewelry, sat a man. He was maybe 40 years old, though it was hard to tell because he was so filthy. His hair hung to his shoulders in matted clumps. His beard was long and tangled with bits of food and debris, and his clothes were nothing but rags held together with sinew and strips of leather. His hands were caked with dried blood and dirt, his fingernails grown into claws from never being cut. But it was his eyes that really got to the soldiers, wild eyes that seemed to look through them rather than at them, eyes that held no recognition of humanity, no connection to the civilized world. The man didn't try to run when the Cossacks entered his cave. He just sat there, rocking slightly, making a low growling sound in his throat. When they grabbed him and dragged him out into the daylight, he hissed and tried to cover his eyes, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. They bound his hands with rope, and he didn't resist, just kept making those animal sounds, growling and whimpering and occasionally howling. They brought him back to the nearest village, a place called Belleretsk, where the local authorities could decide what to do with him. News of his capture spread fast, and people came from surrounding settlements to see the monster who'd been terrorizing the mountains. The man was locked in a barn while the military conducted their investigation, and what they found in his cave told a story that was both tragic and terrifying. Among the belongings were identity papers for a man named Ivan Smirnov, a former soldier who deserted from the army in 1796 and disappeared into the wilderness. Court records showed he'd been accused of killing a fellow soldier in a fight over gambling debts, and he'd fled rather than face trial. That was 4 years before the attack started, which meant he'd been living alone in that cave for years before he began hunting people. The authorities tried to question him, but Ivan, if that's who he really was, seemed incapable of human speech. He would growl and snarl, would bare his teeth when approached, would eat only raw meat and refuse cooked food. When they brought him water in a cup, he wouldn't drink, but when they poured it into a bowl on the floor, he lapped it up like an animal. A priest was brought in to try to reach whatever humanity might remain, and Ivan attacked him, trying to bite his throat before the guards pulled him away. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Ivan started talking, not in Russian, but in broken, growled phrases that sounded more animal than human. And what he said terrified everyone who heard it. He claimed he wasn't a man anymore. He said he'd become a wolf, that the transformation had happened gradually over the years alone in the wilderness, that he could feel himself changing with each full moon, growing stronger, faster, more connected to the beast inside him. He said he hunted because that's what wolves do, and the taste of human flesh was sweeter than any animal. Now, obviously, werewolves aren't real. We know that. But in 1800, in rural Russia, people absolutely believed in them. The concept of lycanthropy was taken seriously, and there were documented cases of courts trying and executing people for being werewolves. So when Ivan started claiming he was a wolf in human form, when he demonstrated behavior that seemed more animal than human, when 15 people were dead and this creature was the only possible culprit, the villagers didn't see a traumatized hermit who'd gone insane from isolation. They saw a monster that needed to be destroyed. The military commander wanted to transport Ivan to a proper prison to have him tried in a court of law for the murders. But the villagers, led by the families of the victims, demanded immediate justice. They argued that transporting Ivan would risk him escaping or attacking more people. They said a werewolf couldn't be contained by ordinary means, that he would break free and continue killing. And they pointed out that under Russian law, they had the right to protect their community from supernatural threats. A mob formed outside the barn where Ivan was being held, hundreds of people carrying torches and farming tools, demanding the creature be turned over to them. The military commander, with only 20 soldiers and facing a crowd that vastly outnumbered him, made a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. He stepped aside and let the mob have their prisoner. They dragged Ivan from the barn into the village square, and he fought them every step of the way, snarling and snapping his teeth, trying to bite anyone who got close. The crowd was screaming for his death, shouting about justice and protection and cleansing the land of evil. Someone built a pyre in the center of the square, stacking wood and brush and anything that would burn. And despite the military commander's protests, despite the priest's pleas for mercy, despite everything civilized law should have demanded, they tied Ivan to a stake and set him on fire. Ivan's screams as he burned were described as inhuman, a sound that was part howl and part shriek and part something that had no name. He struggled against the ropes, his hair catching fire first, then his clothes, then his skin. The crowd watched in silence as he burned, some making the sign of the cross, some covering their ears against the screaming, some turning away but unable to look away completely. It took maybe 10 minutes for Ivan to die, though witnesses said it felt like hours, and when the fire finally consumed him completely, there was nothing left but ash and bone and the smell of burned flesh that would linger in that square for weeks. The attacks stopped after that. No more disappearances, no more bodies found torn apart on the mountain trails, the trade route reopened, merchants returned, and life in the villages went back to normal. The villagers took this as proof that they'd killed a werewolf, that Ivan Smirnov had truly been a monster in human form, and that burning him had lifted a curse from the land. But the military commander who'd been forced to surrender Ivan to the mob had a different interpretation. In his official report, he wrote that Ivan Smirnov was a deserter who'd lived in isolation so long he'd lost his humanity, not through supernatural transformation, but through the simple erosion of civilized behavior. He'd become a feral human, an animal in man's shape, driven by instinct and madness rather than demonic possession. And the mob had burned a sick man alive because they needed to believe in monsters rather than confront the possibility that one of their own could become something so terrible. In 2026, we understand that prolonged isolation can cause severe psychological damage, that humans need social contact to maintain their humanity, that someone living alone in a cave for years would deteriorate mentally and physically in ways that might seem monstrous. We know Ivan Smirnov wasn't a werewolf, that the full moon doesn't trigger transformation, that his crimes were the result of madness and trauma, not supernatural evil. But I don't know about you, but I find something deeply disturbing about the mob's certainty. They were so convinced they were fighting evil that they committed evil themselves, burning a man alive without trial, without due process, without mercy. They became monsters while hunting one, and they never saw the irony because they believed absolutely in their own righteousness. Ivan Smirnov died in agony in that village square, and whether he was a werewolf or just a broken man who'd become an animal through isolation, we'll never really know. What we do know is that 15 people were dead, that something in those mountains had been hunting humans, and that when it was captured and killed, the attacks stopped. Sometimes the simplest explanation isn't the most comforting one. At least those villagers believed in monsters and evil and the need for protection, however brutally they expressed it. Our next case takes us back to civilization, to America, where a man who helped write the rules of society would be murdered by someone who knew those rules could be twisted to protect the guilty. In the spring of 1806, one of America's founding fathers lay dying in agony in his Richmond, Virginia home, and he knew exactly who was killing him. George Wythe, 80 years old, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and mentor to Thomas Jefferson, spent his final days watching his grandnephew inherit everything he owned while the law he'd helped create protected his murderer from justice. The poison had been administered slowly, carefully, over years, and by the time Wythe realized what was happening, it was already too late. Richmond, in 1806, was a young city trying hard to be sophisticated, the new capital of Virginia after Williamsburg had been deemed too small and too tied to colonial memories. The houses along Main Street were built in the federal style, red brick with white columns, speaking of prosperity and Republican virtue. The streets were wide and planned, not the organic tangles of older cities, and at night you could smell honeysuckle growing over garden walls, mixing with the less pleasant odors of horse manure and the James River's muddy banks. George Wythe's house was one of the finest in Richmond, a 3-story brick mansion with a library that took up an entire floor. The shelves were packed with books in Latin and Greek and English, legal texts and philosophy and poetry, the accumulated knowledge of a man who'd spent his life studying law and teaching others to love it as much as he did. The morning light would stream through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted through air that smelled of old leather and ink, and the pipe tobacco Wythe occasionally smoked. Wythe himself was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, with white hair he kept tied back in the old colonial style, even though that fashion had passed. His face was lined deeply from 8 decades of life, but his eyes were still sharp, still missing nothing. He walked with a slight stoop from years of bending over law books, and his hands were spotted with age but steady enough to write in the precise, elegant script that had signed the Declaration of Independence 30 years earlier. He'd never remarried after his wife died in 1787, had no children of his own, and had poured his paternal instincts into teaching. Thomas Jefferson had studied law under him and credited Wythe with shaping his thinking about justice and democracy. Dozens of other prominent Virginians had learned from Wythe, and he was respected throughout the state as a living link to the Revolution, a reminder of the principles America was supposed to stand for. But Wythe was lonely in his old age, rattling around that big house with only servants for company, so when his grandnephew, George Wythe Sweeney, appeared in 1801, claiming to want a relationship with his famous relative, Wythe welcomed him with open arms. Sweeney was the grandson of Wythe's sister, a young man of 20 who said he wanted to study law, to follow in his great-uncle's footsteps, to make something of himself. Wythe, who'd always wanted a son, saw this as a gift in his declining years. George Wythe Sweeney was handsome in the way that lets people get away with things, with dark hair and an easy smile and a talent for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. He moved into Wythe's house, supposedly to study, and Wythe paid for his expenses, bought him clothes and books, introduced him to important people. Wythe even changed his will. leaving everything to Sweeney with the understanding that the boy would carry on the family name and honor Wythe's legacy. But Sweeney had no interest in law or legacy. He was interested in money, specifically his great-uncle's money, and he was willing to wait for it only so long. At first, he made some effort to pretend, sitting in the library with books open, attending court sessions, asking intelligent questions. But as months turned into years, his true nature emerged. He gambled heavily, losing money Wythe had given him for tuition. He drank too much and came home late, smelling of whiskey and cheap perfume. He ran up debts with local merchants and expected Wythe to pay them. Wythe, who'd been such a good judge of character in his legal career, was blind when it came to family. He made excuses for Sweeney, paid the debts, lectured him gently about responsibility and self-control. And when Sweeney's behavior got particularly bad, when the gambling debts got too large or the scandals too public, Wythe would threaten to change his will to cut Sweeney out of his inheritance. These threats would produce temporary improvement, a few weeks of good behavior before Sweeney would slide back into his old patterns. By 1805, Wythe was starting to lose patience. At 79 years old, he'd begun to feel his mortality, and the realization that he'd wasted 5 years on an ungrateful wastrel sat heavy on his conscience. He started talking about changing his will again, but this time he meant it. He told friends he was going to leave his estate to establish a school for poor children, that Sweeney had proven himself unworthy of the Wythe name. Sweeney heard these rumors, and something in him shifted from impatient to desperate. The poisoning probably started in the winter of 1805, though the exact date is impossible to pinpoint. Wythe began experiencing stomach troubles, nothing severe at first, just occasional nausea and loss of appetite. He attributed it to age, to too much rich food at Christmas dinners, to the general decline that comes with entering your 9th decade. His doctor agreed, prescribed rest and a bland diet, and thought nothing more of it. But the symptoms didn't improve. They got worse, slowly, gradually, in a way that seemed natural, but in retrospect was carefully controlled. Wythe would have good days and bad days, weeks where he felt almost normal, followed by weeks where he could barely keep down water. He lost weight, his skin took on a grayish tinge, and his hands developed a tremor that made writing difficult. Friends who visited commented on how frail he looked, how the great George Wythe seemed to be fading before their eyes. What nobody knew, what wouldn't be discovered until it was too late, was that Sweeney had been adding arsenic to Wythe's morning coffee. Not a lot, not enough to kill quickly, but a steady accumulation that would mimic the symptoms of various diseases and old age. Arsenic was easy to obtain in 1806, sold openly in apothecaries for killing rats, and it was tasteless in small doses, especially in the bitter coffee Wythe preferred. The house employed several servants, including a free black woman named Lydia Broadnax, who served as cook and housekeeper. Lydia had worked for Wythe for over a decade, and she noticed things that others missed. She saw how Sweeney would linger in the kitchen in the mornings, would insist on preparing Wythe's coffee himself, claiming he wanted to do something nice for his great-uncle. She noticed how Wythe's symptoms seemed worse on days after Sweeney had been particularly attentive. And she noticed something else, something that would ultimately prove crucial. Sweeney preparing the same coffee for a young enslaved boy named Michael Brown, who also lived in the household. Michael was maybe 16 years old, another of Wythe's projects. Wythe believed slavery was morally wrong and had freed all his slaves years earlier, but he'd taken in Michael as a ward, teaching him to read and write, planning to leave him money in his will so he could start life as a free man with some resources. Michael and Lydia both drank coffee from the same pot as Wythe on the morning of May 25, 1806, coffee that Sweeney had prepared with unusual care. Within hours, all three of them were violently ill. Wythe was the worst, doubled over with stomach cramps that made him scream, vomiting continuously, his skin burning with fever. Michael was almost as bad, convulsing and delirious. Lydia was sick too, but not as severely, maybe because she'd drunk less of the coffee, or because her younger body was better able to fight the poison. Doctors were called, and they diagnosed it as cholera or food poisoning, something they'd all eaten or drunk that had gone bad. But Wythe even in his agony, even with his mind clouded by pain and poison, made a connection that the doctors missed. He called for his lawyer and, in a voice barely above a whisper, dictated a new will. He left nothing to Sweeney, everything to Michael, and to establishing the school for poor children he'd been planning. And then he told the lawyer something that changed everything. He believed Sweeney had poisoned him. The lawyer, a man named William Munford, was shocked but took the accusation seriously. He went to the authorities and they began investigating. They questioned Sweeney, who denied everything with the same easy charm he'd used to manipulate Wythe for 5 years. They searched his room and found a packet of white powder hidden in a book. When analyzed, it was arsenic, enough to kill a dozen people, let alone one old man and a teenage boy. Michael Brown died on May 27th, 2 days after drinking the poisoned coffee. He died in terrible pain, his insides destroyed by the arsenic, and his last words were about the coffee tasting strange, bitter in a way that was different from normal bitterness. Wythe lingered longer, his old body fighting the poison with a stubbornness that matched his personality, but it was a losing battle. He died on June 8, 1806, 2 weeks after the poisoning, surrounded by friends who wept for the loss of a great man. George Wythe's final days were spent in full awareness of what had happened to him. He knew his grandnephew had poisoned him, had killed him slowly over months for money. He knew that Michael, an innocent boy whose only crime was being in Wythe's will, had been murdered as collateral damage. And he knew something else, something that aided him even more than the poison. Under Virginia law, Sweeney might get away with it. Because the only witness who could testify to seeing Sweeney prepare the poisoned coffee was Lydia Broadnax. And Lydia was black. And Virginia law in 1806 explicitly prohibited black people, whether free or enslaved, from testifying against white people in court. This law had been designed to protect white slave owners from accusations by the people they enslaved to maintain the racial hierarchy that the entire Southern economy depended on. But now it was protecting a murderer from justice. The trial of George Wythe Sweeney was held in Richmond in September of 1806. The prosecution had circumstantial evidence: Sweeney's gambling debts, his motive to inherit quickly, the arsenic found in his room, Wythe's deathbed accusation. What they didn't have was direct testimony from the only person who'd actually witnessed the poisoning. Lydia Broadnax sat in the courtroom ready to testify, but when the prosecution called her to the stand, the defense objected on the grounds that her testimony was inadmissible. The judge, following the letter of Virginia law, agreed. Lydia's testimony could not be heard by the jury. She could not swear an oath, could not describe what she'd seen, could not tell the truth about how Sweeney had prepared that coffee with such careful attention. The law that George Wythe had spent his life upholding, the same legal system he'd helped create through his teaching and his service, was now being used to protect his killer. Without Lydia's testimony, the prosecution's case fell apart. Circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. Yes, Sweeney had debts and a motive. Yes, he had arsenic in his possession. Yes, Wythe had accused him. But the defense argued that many people had arsenic for pest control, that Wythe was old and might have been confused, that there was no direct proof Sweeney had actually poisoned anyone. The jury, composed entirely of white men who benefited from the same laws that excluded Lydia's testimony, deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty. George Wythe Sweeney walked out of that courthouse a free man. He'd murdered his great-uncle and an innocent boy, and he faced no legal consequences whatsoever. Virginia law had protected him perfectly, just as it was designed to do. The irony was so bitter it made people sick. A founding father murdered by his own grandnephew, and the legal system he'd helped build let the killer go free because the only witness was black. Sweeney didn't inherit anything because Wythe had changed his will before dying, but that was small comfort. He left Richmond shortly after the trial, moved to Tennessee, and lived another 40 years, dying of natural causes in 1846 at age 65. He never faced justice, never showed remorse, never acknowledged what he'd done. To the end, he maintained his innocence, and because the law had declared him not guilty, society accepted that verdict. Lydia Broadnax, who'd worked for Wythe for years, who'd witnessed the murder, who'd tried to testify and been silenced by law, received a small bequest from White's estate and used it to leave Virginia entirely. She couldn't live in a place where her truth meant nothing, where the law valued her life and testimony as worthless compared to a white man's comfort. She died in Pennsylvania in 1828, and her obituary made no mention of the most significant moment of her life, the day she tried to speak truth to power and was legally gagged. George Wythe's death sent shockwaves through American legal and political circles. Thomas Jefferson wrote that he wept when he heard of his mentor's murder, and that the failure to convict Sweeney was a stain on Virginia's honor. Other legal scholars pointed out the grotesque irony of a man who'd signed the Declaration of Independence, a document claiming all men are created equal, being murdered by a system of inequality his generation had failed to dismantle. But nothing changed. Virginia's law prohibiting black testimony against whites remained in place until after the Civil War, protecting criminals and enabling injustice for another 60 years. And Wythe's murder became a footnote in history, a tragic end to a great man's life, but not a catalyst for the legal reform he might have hoped for. In 2026, we like to think we've moved beyond laws that explicitly protect certain people based on race. But the fundamental problem Wythe's case revealed that legal systems can be constructed to protect power rather than pursue justice, that the rules can be written to ensure certain voices are never heard, that's still with us in different forms. The methods change, the language evolves, but the core issue of who gets believed and who gets silenced remains very much alive. George Wythe died knowing his murderer would walk free, killed by a legal system he'd spent his life building and a racial hierarchy he'd opposed but never successfully dismantled. If there's a hell for irony, that's what it looks like. And maybe, just maybe, the worst part is knowing that 200 years later, we're still struggling with the same questions about justice and equality that Wythe's death should have answered. The next story might make you question everything you think you know about the powerful and their secrets, because sometimes the most dangerous conspiracies aren't theories at all. In the winter of 1801, in a stone hunting lodge on the outskirts of Dublin, Ireland, something terrible happened behind locked doors. The authorities found a room drenched in blood, walls covered in occult symbols, and evidence of a ritual that should have left a body. But there was no body, just blood. So much blood that it had soaked into the floorboards and dripped through the ceiling into the room below. And when they questioned the men who'd been there that night, all of them, high-ranking politicians and members of Ireland's elite, they got a story so absurd it could only be a lie, or the truth was even worse. The Hellfire Club wasn't actually called that by its members. They referred to themselves as the Order of St. Francis, a joke name meant to mock the pious and the religious. But everyone else called them the Hellfire Club because of the rumors that swirled around their activities, whispers about black masses and demonic rituals and acts of depravity that polite society refused to name out loud. They met in a lodge on Montpelier Hill, a remote location where screams wouldn't carry to nearby villages and where privacy was absolute. The lodge itself was a squat stone building that had been constructed as a hunting retreat decades earlier, but had fallen into disrepair and been purchased by the club members for their meetings. It sat on top of the hill like a wart on the landscape, surrounded by bare trees that creaked in the constant wind. The building had thick walls, narrow windows, and a single heavy wooden door that could be barred from the inside. Inside, the main room had a large fireplace, rough wooden furniture, and walls that had been painted black at some point, though the paint was peeling and flaking. The club had maybe 20 members, all men, all wealthy, all connected to Irish politics or the legal system or the Anglican Church. They were barristers and members of parliament, judges and landowners, the kind of people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. During the day, they were respectable pillars of society. At night, at least once a month when the club met, they engaged in activities that ranged from the merely scandalous to the potentially criminal. Most of their meetings were exercises in aristocratic boredom, trying to shock itself into feeling something. Excessive drinking, gambling for absurd stakes, hiring prostitutes, and conducting mock religious ceremonies where the women played roles in parodies of Catholic Mass. It was juvenile, offensive, and exactly the kind of thing rich men with too much time and too little oversight would do. But it was also, technically, legal. Blasphemous and morally questionable, sure, but not actually against any law. But the meeting on January 13th, 1801, was different. The rumors about what happened that night started circulating within days, whispered in Dublin pubs and parlors, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The core story was consistent, though. The Hellfire Club had conducted a ritual, a real one, involving a young woman who'd been brought to the lodge against her will. Depending on who was telling the story, she was a prostitute or a servant or a virgin sacrifice. What happened to her varied too, but all versions ended with her death. The authorities might have dismissed it as just more scandalous rumors, except for one problem. A young woman named Catherine Walsh had gone missing. Catherine was 22, a housemaid who worked for a family in Dublin, and she disappeared on the night of January 13th after leaving work to walk home. Her route would have taken her near the base of Montpelier Hill, and several people reported seeing a carriage, the kind wealthy men used, in that area around the time Catherine would have been walking past. Catherine's family filed a missing person report, and the constables made inquiries. They heard the rumors about the Hellfire Club, heard whispers that Catherine had been seen being forced into a carriage by men in expensive clothes, heard secondhand accounts of screaming coming from the lodge that night. It was enough to get a warrant, and on January 20th, a group of constables climbed Montpelier Hill to investigate. They found the lodge locked and apparently empty. When they forced the door open, the smell hit them first, copper and something rotten, strong enough to make several men gag. The main room looked normal at first glance. Furniture in place, fireplace cold, nothing obviously wrong. But then they noticed the door to the back room and the dark stains on the floor leading toward it. The back room was maybe 15 feet square, with no windows and a single door. When the constables opened it, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The floor was covered in dried blood, pools of it, so much that it had formed puddles in the low spots where the floorboards had warped. The walls were splattered with blood in patterns that suggested violence, struggle, arterial spray, and covering every available surface were symbols drawn in what appeared to be more blood. Pentagrams, inverted crosses, strange sigils that none of the constables recognized, words in Latin and possibly other languages. In the center of the room was a wooden table, rough-hewn and stained dark. On the table were candles, dozens of them, melted down to nubs, their wax mixed with blood that had dripped from the table's surface. There were other objects too, a silver chalice, a black-handled knife with a blade that showed dark residue, strips of cloth that might have been used as bindings, and a leather-bound book with pages covered in handwritten text that appeared to be some kind of ritual instructions. What there wasn't was a body. No Catherine Walsh, no remains, no evidence of where all that blood had come from, except that it had clearly come from someone. The constables searched every inch of the lodge, checked the surrounding grounds, looked for signs of a grave or a dumping site. Nothing. Just the blood-soaked room and the knowledge that whoever had lost that much blood was almost certainly dead. They questioned the lodge's caretaker, an old man who lived in a cottage at the base of the hill. He confirmed that the Hellfire Club had met on the night of January 13th, that he'd seen several carriages arrive around sunset and leave before dawn. He said he'd heard nothing unusual, but he was half deaf, and the lodge was far enough from his cottage that he probably wouldn't have heard screaming, even if his hearing was perfect. He had no idea what the club did in their meetings, and claimed he didn't want to know. The constables compiled a list of known Hellfire Club members and began bringing them in for questioning. This was where things got complicated, because the list read like a who's who of Irish power. Lord Richard Parsons, whose father was the Earl of Rothesay. Simon Luttrell, a member of Parliament, Colonel Henry Barry, a military officer with connections to Dublin Castle, Reverend Philip Skelton, an Anglican priest, and at least a dozen others of similar standing. When questioned, every single one of them told the same story, and it was so ridiculous that the constables didn't know whether to laugh or arrest them all on principle. They admitted to being at the lodge on January 13th. They admitted to conducting a ritual. They even admitted to the blood. But according to them, nobody had been hurt. The ritual, they claimed, was a mock black mass, pure theater meant to mock superstition and religious hysteria. The blood was pig's blood, purchased from a butcher, spread around for dramatic effect. The symbols were copied from books, nonsense meant to look occult and scary. The whole thing was an elaborate joke, a performance put on for their own amusement. And the woman? What about Catherine Walsh, who'd been seen being forced into a carriage near the hill? The club members looked genuinely puzzled. They insisted no woman had been at the lodge that night, that their ritual had been performed by members only. If someone had seen a woman being forced into a carriage, it had nothing to do with them. Catherine Walsh, wherever she was, had no connection to the Hellfire Club. The lead investigator, a constable named Thomas McKinley, didn't believe a word of it. The amount of blood in that room was far too much to be from a pig, and the spray patterns were wrong for an animal being butchered. The bindings on the table had marks suggesting human wrists had been tied there, and the timing of Catherine's disappearance, the location, the eyewitness accounts, all of it pointed to the club's involvement. But proving it was another matter entirely. Without a body, without physical evidence beyond the blood, without witnesses willing to testify against powerful men, McKinley had no case. He brought in medical experts to analyze the blood, but in 1801, forensic science was primitive. They couldn't definitively say if it was human or animal, though they noted the quantity was consistent with a human bleeding out. They found hair in the dried blood, but hair analysis was even less developed than blood analysis. McKinley tried a different approach. He offered immunity to any club member willing to testify truthfully about what happened. None of them took the offer. He interviewed every servant, every merchant, every person who might have sold the club supplies or information. He tracked down the butcher shops in Dublin, and none of them had sold pig's blood to anyone connected to the club. He searched for Catherine Walsh's body, dragging pawns, checking abandoned buildings, following every possible lead. Catherine's body was never found. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation stalled. The club members hired expensive lawyers who argued that conducting a theatrical ritual, even a blasphemous one, wasn't a crime. That buying pig's blood and spreading it around for effect wasn't illegal. That without a body, without proof of death, there was no murder case. And technically, they were right. The case was eventually closed as unsolved. The official conclusion was that Catherine Walsh had gone missing under suspicious circumstances, that the Hellfire Club had conducted a ritual involving substantial quantities of blood, but that no direct connection could be established between these two facts. The club members faced no charges, no consequences, no stain on their reputations beyond some embarrassment in society circles. But the unofficial truth, the story everyone in Dublin believed, was darker. The Hellfire Club had murdered Catherine Walsh as part of a genuine occult ritual. They'd bled her out on that table, used her blood to draw their symbols, conducted whatever ceremony they'd planned, and then disposed of her body so cleverly that it was never found. Maybe they buried her somewhere on Montpelier Hill, in ground that had been disturbed so many times by previous burials that one more grave wouldn't be noticed. Maybe they threw her body in the River Liffey, weighted down to sink. Maybe they burned her to ash in the lodge's fireplace. The Hellfire Club never met at the Montpelier Lodge again after January 1801. Some members claimed they disbanded out of respect for the scandal, that the attention had made their activities impossible to continue. Others suggested they simply moved their meetings somewhere else, somewhere more secure, somewhere the authorities wouldn't find evidence even if they looked. Constable McKinley believed the latter, and he spent years trying to track down their new location, never succeeding. Lord Richard Parsons, the most prominent member, maintained his innocence until his death in 1841. His last words, reportedly, were a joke about how vigorously competitive their card games had gotten that night, how the blood was definitely from a fistfight over who had won the last hand. Whether this was the truth or a final mockery of the investigation, nobody could say. The Montpelier Lodge still stands on that hill outside Dublin, though it's a ruin now, open to the elements and covered in graffiti. Tour guides tell the story of the Hellfire Club to tourists, making it spooky and mysterious, leaving out the part about powerful men possibly murdering a housemaid and facing no consequences because the system protected them. The blood stains in the back room are long gone, scrubbed away or worn away by time, but locals swear you can still smell copper on certain nights when the wind is right. Catherine Walsh's family never got closure. She was declared legally dead 7 years after her disappearance, and her mother died soon after. People said of a broken heart. Her father lived until 1828, and he spent those years obsessed with finding his daughter's body, convinced she was somewhere on Montpelier Hill, convinced the Hellfire Club had murdered her. He never found proof, never found her remains, never got the justice he sought. In 2026, the case is occasionally mentioned in books about Irish history and unsolved mysteries. Most authors take the position that we'll never know what really happened, that the truth died with the club members, that maybe Catherine Walsh really did just disappear for unrelated reasons, and the blood at the lodge really was from an elaborate prank. But when you look at the evidence, when you consider the power dynamics, when you think about how often the wealthy and connected have gotten away with horrific crimes throughout history, one conclusion seems more likely than random coincidence. Sometimes the most dangerous conspiracies aren't theories at all. Sometimes they're just powerful people doing terrible things, and the system working exactly as designed to protect them. And sometimes, blood on the walls is exactly what it looks like, no matter what story the people responsible choose to tell. Across the ocean, another institution was failing its people in an even more catastrophic way, though at least in that case, the crime wasn't hidden behind occult symbols and mysterious rituals. It was hidden behind embezzlement and corruption, and the victims numbered in the thousands. On the night of July 23, 1801, in China's Hainan province, the Yellow River breached its dikes and unleashed a wall of water that moved faster than a galloping horse. By morning, over 10,000 people were dead, entire villages had been erased from existence, and the survivors would discover that their deaths weren't an act of God or nature, but the direct result of officials who'd stolen the money meant to prevent exactly this catastrophe. The flood was preventable. The deaths were preventable, and the men responsible would face consequences that were barely more than an inconvenience. The Yellow River earned its name from the massive amounts of silt it carried, sediment from the highlands that turned the water a muddy yellow-brown and made it look thick as soup. This silt was both blessing and curse for the millions who lived along the river's banks. When it flooded gently, it deposited rich soil that made the farmland incredibly fertile. But that same silt also built up in the riverbed over time, raising the water level, making the river flow higher than the surrounding land, turning it into an elevated channel held back only by earthen dikes. Maintaining those dikes was literally a matter of life and death. The Qing dynasty government understood this and had a system in place where local officials collected taxes specifically designated for dike maintenance and repair. Every spring, before the summer rains began, work crews were supposed to reinforce weak sections, raise low points, replace damaged stones, and ensure the dikes could withstand the seasonal flooding. This work was carefully documented, with reports sent to regional governors and ultimately to Beijing, showing how much money was spent and what repairs were completed. In Hainan province in 1801, those reports were lies. The local officials responsible for dike maintenance had been embezzling the repair funds for years, possibly decades. Instead of hiring work crews and buying materials, they'd been diverting the money to build private estates, commission elaborate gardens, purchase luxury goods from European traders, and generally live far beyond what their official salaries should have allowed. The dikes around the village of Lijian, a farming community of maybe 3,000 people, were in particularly terrible condition. The earthen walls that should have been 30 feet thick at the base had eroded to maybe 15 feet in places. Sections that should have been reinforced with stone had never been repaired after previous floods. There were visible cracks, slumping areas where the soil had settled, and spots where water seeped through even during normal river levels. Local farmers had noticed these problems and reported them multiple times to district officials, and each time they were assured repairs would be made. The repairs never came. Li Wei was a farmer in Lijian, 43 years old, with a wife and 5 children ranging from age 7 to 19. His family had worked the same plot of land for 4 generations, growing wheat and millet in soil, enriched by 1,000 years of river silt. The land was good to them, producing enough to feed the family, with surplus to sell at market. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. And Li Wei's oldest son was studying to take the imperial examinations, hoping to lift the family into the scholar class. Li Wei knew the dikes were in bad shape. He'd walked them himself that spring, had seen the cracks and erosion, had pointed them out to his neighbors with growing alarm. In June, when the early summer rains began and the river started rising, Li Wei went to the district magistrate's office and filed a formal complaint. He brought 10 other farmers with him, all of them worried, all of them demanding to know when the promised repairs would happen. The magistrate, a man named Chen Zhao, who wore silk robes that cost more than Li Wei would earn in a year, assured them everything was fine. The dikes had been inspected, he said, and while there were some minor issues, nothing posed an immediate danger. Work crews would address the problems after the flood season when the water level dropped and repairs could be made more easily. It was all handled, all under control, nothing to worry about. Li Wei didn't believe him, but what could a farmer do against a government official? He went home and told his wife to prepare emergency supplies just in case, to pack clothes and food and important documents in baskets that could be grabbed quickly. His wife thought he was being paranoid, that the magistrate surely knew better than they did about dike safety. But she humored him, prepared the baskets, and tried not to think about what would happen if the dikes actually failed. July was particularly wet that year, with rain falling almost daily, sometimes in gentle drizzles, sometimes in torrential downpours that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone indoors. The Yellow River rose steadily, fed by runoff from upstream provinces until the water level was higher than anyone had seen in years. It flowed maybe 10 feet above the surrounding farmland, held back by dikes that groaned under the pressure, that leaked water through 100 small breaches that seemed to shudder when you stood near them. On July 23rd, Li Wei spent the day watching the dikes with increasing dread. The water was lapping at the top of the embankment in several places, and he could see the earthen walls bulging slightly, straining against the weight. He wasn't the only one watching. Dozens of villagers lined the dikes, and some of the smarter ones were already moving their families to higher ground, to the low hills a few miles west where the floodwater wouldn't reach. Li Wei went home and told his family to pack. His wife protested that the magistrate had said everything was fine, that they'd look foolish running away over nothing. Li Wei's oldest son sided with his mother, saying he had studies to complete and couldn't afford to waste time on his father's paranoia. But Li Wei had spent his life reading weather and water, had an instinct for danger that had kept him alive through 4 decades of farming, and that instinct was screaming at him now. He made it an order rather than a request. The family would pack essential items and walk to the hills tonight, right now, no arguments. His wife and children grumbled but obeyed, gathering their prepared baskets, bundling up blankets and extra clothes. As they left, Li Wei took one last look at his home, the house his grandfather had built, and something in his gut told him he'd never see it again. They were maybe halfway to the hills, walking along a dark road with a dozen other families who'd made the same decision when they heard it. A sound like thunder, except it didn't stop, it just kept getting louder. And then someone screamed and pointed back toward the village, and Li Wei turned to look and saw something that would burn itself into his memory forever. The dike had failed. Not cracked, not leaked, but catastrophically collapsed along a section maybe 200 feet wide. The Yellow River, freed from its constraints, was pouring through the gap in a wall of water and silt that had to be 15 feet high. In the darkness, lit only by a half moon, the flood looked like a living thing, a beast made of mud and fury, swallowing everything in its path. The village of Lijian disappeared in less than a minute. 3,000 people, most of them asleep in their beds, most of them trusting the magistrate's assurances that the dikes were safe. The water hit the first houses and simply obliterated them, tearing wood and brick and tile from foundations and sweeping it all away like toys in a bathtub. The sound of it carried for miles, screaming mixed with the roar of water, wood splintering, buildings collapsing. Li Wei stood frozen on that road, watching his world end, knowing that if he'd listened to his wife, if he'd stayed home, his entire family would be dead right now. Around him, other refugees were crying, praying, or standing in shocked silence. The flood spread fast, following the contours of the land, filling every low spot, turning fertile farmland into an inland sea of muddy water that reflected the moonlight like dirty glass. By morning, when the initial surge had passed and the water had spread out enough to slow down, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Legion was gone. So were 4 other villages in the immediate flood zone. Farmland that had fed hundreds of thousands was buried under silt that would take years to clear. Bodies were everywhere, some floating in the water, some tangled in the debris of destroyed houses, some buried in the mud that had settled in thick layers. The death toll was staggering. Official reports would eventually claim 10,000 dead, but that number was almost certainly low because it only counted registered citizens. Beggars, traveling merchants, servants, unmarried women, none of them appeared in official records, and none of them were counted in the final tally. The real number was probably closer to 15 or even 20,000, an entire population erased in a single night. The survivors, maybe 10,000 more who'd fled to high ground or been in villages far enough from the breach to escape, were left with nothing. No homes, no food stores, no livestock, no tools. The Qing government set up refugee camps and provided some emergency relief, rice and tents and basic supplies, but it was woefully inadequate for the scale of the disaster. And then the investigation began. The regional governor, under pressure from Beijing to explain how such a catastrophe had happened, sent inspectors to examine the failed dike section. What they found was damning. The dike hadn't failed because of extraordinary flood conditions or bad luck or an act of God. It had failed because it was built like garbage, maintained like an afterthought, and left to deteriorate until collapse was inevitable. The earthen wall was half the thickness it should have been. The stone reinforcements that records claimed had been installed were absent entirely. The construction was so shoddy that any competent engineer could see it was inadequate just by looking. And when the inspectors started checking other sections of the dike system, they found the same problems everywhere. Miles of embankments that existed on paper but not in reality, repairs that had been documented but never performed, materials that had supposedly been purchased but were nowhere to be found. The money trail led straight to the district magistrate Chen Zhao and his circle of subordinate officials. Over the previous 5 years, they'd been allocated the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of silver taels for dike maintenance. Less than 20% of that money had actually been spent on repairs. The rest had vanished into private pockets used to build the elaborate gardens and mansions that these officials lived in while the people they were supposed to protect drowned. Chen Zhao was arrested along with 6 other officials directly involved in the embezzlement scheme. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified reports, receipts for materials never delivered, testimony from contractors who'd been paid to submit fake invoices. This wasn't a case of negligence or bureaucratic incompetence. This was deliberate theft on a massive scale, and the cost was 10,000 lives. The trial was held in the provincial capital, and it was a spectacle. Survivors testified about the warnings they'd given, about being assured everything was safe, about watching their families die in a flood that shouldn't have happened. Engineers presented technical evidence showing how the embezzlement had directly caused the failure. Financial experts traced the stolen money to luxury purchases and construction projects that Chen Zhao could never have afforded on his official salary. Chen Zhao's defense was that he'd been following orders from higher-level officials, that the embezzlement scheme had existed before he took office, and he'd simply continued it, that everyone did it, and singling him out was unfair. This defense did not help him. The court found all 7 defendants guilty of corruption and negligence, resulting in mass death. Under Qing law, this was a capital offense. Chen Zhao and 2 of his most senior subordinates were sentenced to death by slow slicing, a brutal execution method reserved for the worst crimes. The other 4 officials received lighter sentences, quick beheading rather than prolonged torture. The executions were carried out publicly in the autumn of 1802, with thousands of survivors watching as the men who'd stolen their safety were slowly cut to pieces. But here's the thing that still bothers people who study this case. The executions didn't bring back the dead. They didn't restore the destroyed villages. They didn't return the stolen money to be used for proper repairs. The corrupt officials suffered, yes, but the system that had allowed the corruption to flourish for years remained unchanged. Other officials in other provinces were embezzling dike funds the same way, and most of them never faced consequences because their dikes held just a little longer. Li Wei and his family survived the flood, but everything else was gone. Their land was buried under silt, their house destroyed, their crops wiped out. The government compensation was a joke, barely enough to feed them for 6 months. Li Wei's oldest son, the one who'd been studying for the imperial exams, had to abandon his education and become a manual laborer just to help the family survive. They eventually rebuilt, found new land to farm, created a new life. But it was smaller, harder, diminished. In the refugee camps in the years after the flood, a bitter saying spread among the survivors. The river killed us, but the magistrates buried us first, because that's what it felt like. The officials had killed them through greed and negligence, and then the flood had simply finished the job. The disaster wasn't natural at all. It was murder by corruption, murder by institutional failure, murder dressed up as tragedy. In 2026, floods still kill thousands of people, and corruption still weakens the infrastructure meant to protect them. The Yellow River has been controlled better with modern engineering, but the fundamental problem remains. When the people with power choose to steal instead of serve, when systems designed to protect fail because someone's pocketing the budget, the victims are always the powerless. Chen Zhao died screaming as they cut him apart, and maybe he deserved that death for what he'd done. But his screams didn't bring back the 10,000 people who drowned because he wanted a nicer garden. And honestly, that's the real horror of institutional failure. The guilty sometimes face justice, but the innocent still stay dead. Speaking of institutional failure on an almost unimaginable scale, our next story takes us to England, where the justice system itself would murder an innocent man, and the real killer would confess only after it was too late to matter. You know, after telling you all these stories tonight, from ships that vanished without a trace, to floods caused by corruption, from poisoners in Paris to monsters in the mountains, I keep coming back to one uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it wears expensive clothes and sits in positions of power. Sometimes it's a family member you trust. Sometimes it's the very systems we built to protect us. These 14 stories span different countries, different crimes, different centuries, but they all share something. They all show us what happens when the powerful believe they're above consequences, when institutions fail, the people they're supposed to serve, when ordinary human greed or rage or madness is allowed to run unchecked because nobody with authority cares enough to stop it. The Mohawks got away with it because their fathers were magistrates. George Wythe's killer walked free because racist laws silenced the only witness. The Hellfire Club's blood-soaked room led to 0 arrests because politicians protect their own. 10,000 people drowned because officials wanted nicer gardens. Again and again, we see the same pattern. Power protecting itself while the powerless suffer. If there's anything to take away from tonight, it's this. Question authority. Demand accountability. Don't assume that just because someone has a title or wealth or position that they have your best interests at heart. The monsters in these stories weren't supernatural. They were human beings who believed, often correctly, that they could get away with anything. And here's what gets me about these cases. Most of them, the victims had no power, no voice, no way to fight back. Housemaids and farmers and sailors and servants, people just trying to live their lives, destroyed by others who saw them as disposable. That's not ancient history. That pattern is still with us. The details change, the methods evolve, but the fundamental truth remains. Honestly, what haunts me isn't the violence itself. It's the indifference. The systems that looked at injustice and shrugged. The people who could have helped and chose not to. The institutions that valued order over justice, reputation over truth, power over humanity. Thank you for spending your night with me. for listening to these dark stories, for letting me share the strange, the mysterious, and yes, the deeply disturbing parts of history that don't make it into textbooks. If you found value in tonight's stories, consider subscribing. And maybe, just maybe, let these stories remind you to speak up when you see injustice, to demand better from people in power, to remember that silence in the face of evil is its own kind of crime. Now get some sleep, if you can.